Bonjour à toutes et tous. Bienvenue au 12e colloque Kixlax, éduquer en temps de crise et faire face à l'urgence, des réflexions menées à partir de la recherche sur les richesses, les défis et les opportunités en matière d'éducation en Amérique centrale et dans les Caraïbes. On va commencer dans quelques instants, donc je vous donne la bienvenue à tout le monde et on va attendre quelques minutes pour commencer.
Good morning, colleagues. We're really glad to have you here. We are starting in a few minutes. We're just waiting a few people, but we are already prepared. Please, if you need interpretation, you can choose in the bottom below the screen. You can find interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. A los colegas que hablan español, también les comento que vamos a comenzar en muy breves minutos. Ya está todo preparado para comenzar. Simplemente comentar que pueden elegir el idioma de preferencia. Las presentaciones serán en inglés y francés, pero hay traducción al español en caso de que lo requieran. Eso, muchas gracias.
Voilà, donc, on va commencer cette journée. On est très ravis d'être ici avec tout le monde. Nous sommes reconnaissants à tous ceux qui ont accepté cette invitation, à tous ceux qui sont présents avec leurs travaux et ceux qui nous écoutent aussi aujourd'hui. Nous vous demandons de préciser dans le chat votre nom, les pays et l'institution que vous représentez. Aussi, c'est intéressant de connaître également vos intérêts thématiques ou des recherches. Aujourd'hui, nous avons réuni ici une grande diversité de chercheurs et chercheuses de la région et nous souhaitons que cet espace, au-delà de la réflexion, devienne une expérience d'échange de toutes les personnes présentes. Nous avons des questions, si vous avez des questions, excusez-moi, et vous pouvez utiliser la fonction de questions-réponses disponible sur le Zoom. Cet événement est diffusé sur nos réseaux sociaux. Et nous vous invitons donc à rejoindre notre fanpage de Facebook que vous pouvez trouver sur le nom de Kixlax Hub. Comme ça, et vous pouvez suivre toutes nos activités, des nouvelles et tous les événements que nous réalisons. Et aussi les réseaux sociaux de Zoom. Nous sommes présents sur Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn et sur notre site web www.sumaedu.org. Nous sommes en train de surveiller les réseaux sociaux, alors n'hésitez pas à participer et à poser des questions tout au long du colloque. Nous vous invitons également à partager sur les réseaux sociaux avec les hashtags Coloquio Kixlax, Educación et Émergence et nous taguer sur @Kixlax, @Sumaedu. C'est un honneur pour nous de pouvoir vous rencontrer et d'avoir des représentants de plus de 4 pays de la région pour discuter les problématiques, les opportunités et les défis qui émergent dans des situations de crise et d'urgence dans la région. On sait très bien que cette région, il y a pas mal d'urgences et de crises, donc c'est vraiment un moment très important pour réfléchir autour de ces sujets. Et comme Raoul vient de dire, le colloque sera en français et en anglais, aussi avec des traductions d'interprétation en espagnol, donc vous pouvez choisir votre langue. L'heure du jour de cet événement sera divisée en 2 parties. La première table ronde portera sur les défis de la recherche pour le renforcement des actions éducatives axées sur les contextes de crise et d'urgence. Le orateur principal de cette premier panel, c'est le docteur Joel Guarican. C'est le directeur de l'école d'éducation de l'Université de West Indies. Aussi, sera présent et l'INE avec Sonja Anderson, c'est la coordinatrice de Data Evidence, et aussi avec Nathalie Bienfait, je ne sais pas si j'ai bien prononcé, c'est l'assistante de communication du INE. Et la dernière présentation sera menée par l'équipe LAX, représentée par Raoul Chacón, directeur du KIX, et moi-même, Maciel Morales, chercheuse du KIX LAX. La 12e table ronde portera sur les expériences territoriales de la recherche éducative dans les situations de crise et d'urgence. On aura l'honneur d'écouter la docteure Bernard King, coordinatrice du programme de licence en éducation de l'Université de Wisconsin, la docteure Charmaine Bicessard, chef de service d'éducation en ligne de l'Université de Guyana, et Idélia Ferdinand, Senior Education, et le docteur Lefranc Joseph de l'Université de l'État d'Haïti. Les colloques, il y aura une duration à peu près de 3 heures avec des intervalles respectifs à une petite pause au milieu, et nous vous invitons à rejoindre pendant toutes les présentations. Maintenant, je vais donner la parole à Florencio Ceballos, qui est sociologue. Il est MBA en sciences de l'éducation à l'Université Paris 8 en France. Il est spécialiste principal du programme des échanges de connaissances et d'innovation GPE-KIX. Merci, Florencio.
Merci. Oh, attends. Vous m'écoutez là? Oui? OK. Merci beaucoup, Maciel. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Welcome to everyone today. I will try to be very brief. I first would like to thank, and I will switch to English. I will not move back to French because I know that drives our translators crazy for a good reason. I would like to thank first SUMA, OECS, and the participants for this opportunity. The Knowledge and Innovation Exchange main role, main mandate, is to generate and mobilize knowledge. And that implies supporting and giving visibility to research at different stages and levels, from large, multi-year, multi-country, multi-million dollars that we have founded through KIX, to those that are smaller and contribute a lot to the understanding of the problems on a local and applied level. Those are as important as those big fishes. I would like to say that educating in times of crisis is a central issue, something that has been identified and surfaced by colleagues and partners in all the regions where KIX works. And I think that it's important also to remind or to consider or to point out that crises are multiple. We're not talking about one crisis. It's a climate crisis, our political and economic stability, migratory processes, violence, and so on. So crisis is in plural in this case. And I think that beyond or under circumstantial emergencies, what is represented here is an underlying and rather complex process that we could call crisis. And even though those days, this crisis has a name, which is COVID-19 and the learning losses left by the pandemic and how that weaknessed the national education systems, I think it's important to consider that it only came to amplify and accelerate a crisis that already existed. And I think that this perspective should not be lost. So I hope that today will be a day to learn a lot, but also to debate and compare and discuss a lot. I would be happy to be part of this discussion. So without further ado, I would like to thank everyone and wish the best luck for today's activities. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. À bientôt.
Merci beaucoup, Florencio, pour tes paroles de bienvenue. Et on est vraiment ravis de cette opportunité d'être ici avec tous les chercheurs et chercheuses et tous les publics. Et sans plus attendre, j'ai le plaisir de présenter en avant-première la première revue de recherche KIX-LAC. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier tous les partenaires qui ont aidé et participé à cette compilation des articles qui sont présentés lors du premier colloque en décembre 2021. Voilà, ça on peut voir les images. Donc, je voudrais remercier à GPE, à l'IDRC, à OEX et à l'INE pour avoir participé de cet événement. Cette revue, c'est un énorme effort de toute l'équipe, de tous les partenaires et aussi l'équipe de Kickflags pour pouvoir aller au-delà de cette réunion, de cette colloque, essayer de pouvoir diffuser les recherches, diffuser les articles, diffuser les études que les chercheurs et chercheuses ils ont réalisées. Donc, cette revue, c'est la compilation, comme je viens de dire, de 7 articles présentés au colloque sur les mêmes sujets, éduquer en temps de crise et d'urgence, mais on a mis l'accent sur les pays de l'Amérique centrale. Il y a des études présentes de Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador et Guatemala. La revue présente des enjeux territoriaux de l'enseignement dans la pandémie, mais aussi, comme vient de dire Florencio, dans des autres urgences, dans des autres crises. Il y a aussi utilisé le mot de multi-urgence dans la région. Aussi, on a mis l'accent, on s'est concentré sur le bien-être de la communauté éducative. C'est également intéressant de dire pour notre revue les problématiques, d'exposer les problèmes de la région, mais il présente également des stratégies pour combattre les problèmes qu'il présente. Donc vraiment, cette revue, c'est une énorme richesse. Et Marc, si tu peux passer l'autre diapo, s'il te plaît. Le journal est en espagnol, car cette colloque s'était concentrée en espagnol, mais il sera bientôt en circulation et on a cette idée de pouvoir les traduire dans plusieurs langues. Donc, nous avons voulu faire cette présentation pour dire que cette colloque d'aujourd'hui, aussi, on a l'intention de faire une 12e numéro de la revue avec les articles présents aujourd'hui, avec l'objectif de pouvoir profondir, de pouvoir disséminer, de pouvoir partager la recherche dans la région, parce qu'on sait qu'on a un problème, c'est qu'on a énormément de défis pour pouvoir potentier la recherche. Donc voilà, c'est pour ça que je voudrais présenter cette revue. Maintenant, on va commencer notre premier panel de la journée, qui s'intitule « Les défis de la recherche pour renforcer les actions éducatives axées sur les contextes de crise et d'urgence ». Pour ce premier panel, on a le plaisir de présenter à Dr. Joël Guarican comme l'orateur principal. Dr. Joël Guarican travaille dans le domaine de l'éducation depuis 30 ans avec une expérience dans l'enseignement à tous les niveaux. Il est actuellement directeur de l'école d'éducation de l'Université de West Indies, campus Cape Hill. Il est titulaire d'une chaire de professeur d'éducation en langue, alphabétisation et études interlinguistiques. Merci beaucoup, Dr. Guarican.
Okay, good morning, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. And Suma, I must say special thanks to you and all the sponsors of this great event. You may wonder about my topic, conducting research in the Caribbean, combating the biases of Western frames, when we are actually speaking about education in times of crisis and emergency. But in truth and in fact, as we think about research in the Caribbean and many parts of the world, that in itself is a crisis, the way in which research is done, the assumptions that are made, the findings and interpretations that are made that are often not reflective of the truth. So indeed, I consider that a crisis. I really want to start in the way that I start a lot of my presentations these days, to remind us about our context, the context of the Caribbean, which is very similar to the context of many other parts that are non-Westerns. So for example, in Latin America. Start by telling you, we were a colonized people. We were enslaved. We were decimated, indoctrinated. They used us for cheap labor. I should correct that. They used us for free labor through slavery, enriched colonizers. They imposed on us foreign cultures, languages, societal norms, privileging the ways of the colonizers. It's interesting that to appear kind and benevolent, they introduced to us Christianity and things like education. And I like to say there was nothing kind about colonialism. In fact, it was brutal. So education, which they introduced in the Caribbean, with it came something called streaming. That's a system of stratification that you go into top classes and others are almost rejected. You go into top schools and others are marginalized. And at the end, when you leave secondary school in the Caribbean, or high school as some of you would call it, the certification exams, which says that you're ready for the world of work, or you're ready for university and college, only about 25% or even less meet the standards of 5 subjects with English and math. Just imagine that. Of the thousands of children, only about 25% meet the matriculation standards to get into college or university and into the world of work. How kind is that system? That is the system that we have clung to. I want to just, before I get into the presentation, I just want to quote the words of Day 2016. If you want to know how heavy a bag of salt is, ask the one who is carrying it. And before I go into that, I want to just further highlight something that Day says. He highlights the expressed viewpoint that academic research is so thoroughly compromised by its entanglements with colonialism that it is fundamentally incompatible with indigenous communities and their priorities. So carrying the bag of salt, this is an interesting perspective on research. Who is carrying that bag of salt? Who is taking the burden? And there is of the opinion that knowledge cannot be merely garnered through observation as we do in research, or the fragmentation of measurement, all those measures that we impose on our subjects when we are doing research, that these are not enough. The question is, who is the knowledge expert in the context of research? Is it the researcher, whether it is a local researcher or a foreign researcher? Or is it the participants with their lived experiences? And this is an important question that we have to answer, because people come into our spaces and they do research and they go back with great findings, write it up, and the perspective that they present, we cannot recognize it ourselves. Quite often, it is not reflective of what is really happening on the ground. So I continue to ask the question, who is carrying that bag of salt? This is a Ghanaian proverb. Who is carrying that bag of salt? So I start with the premise that external researchers, though very important, I'm not minimizing their importance, are not the sole knowledge experts. In fact, they're not the ones carrying the bag of salt. Their research is often flawed and not reflective of the true picture. So when we think about researchers coming into our space, looking through Western frames, what are we talking about? we are talking about traditionally white, male, that has been widened, middle class. So they're looking through those particular lenses, often disregarding cultural and linguistic context of our region. And I'm sure that this has application into Latin America also. Privileging solutions that originate in the so-called first world countries and rejecting or at least devaluing local solutions. They have very little use for what our own common practices. And then they leave with distorted perspective. Our data is interpreted through Western lens and may be very misleading in those interpretations and quite biased. So I can give you an example. This is a school in Grenada, but this is reflective of most of our schools that were built in the 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s. And of course, these were built through external funding, through the funding agencies. And in those days, when they came with their development plans of building schools, they came with their architects and so forth. And their Western logic pretty much said, we need to build you schools in your hot climate that will keep the children and the teachers cool and nice. So they built them with all of these decorative blocks so that the breeze can go through very easily. Against what local knowledge was saying. Local knowledge was saying to them, but if you do this, when it rains, with driving winds, the students are going to be wet because the water is going to go through. This is how most of our schools are. But their Western logic prevailed and we got these schools. Well, guess what? These schools are also hurricane shelters. Can you see people being in here during a hurricane? If you know what a hurricane is, of 100 miles per hour wind, ferocious winds with rain and with floods. These are the structures that we have as hurricane shelters. These are emergency shelters. So in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, where you had a volcanic eruption last year, you had shelters like this. These are the schools that are used, but built through Western logic, through Western frames, knowing more than the local knowledge. Perception is bias. And I know many of you here may not be into the sport cricket, but I want to use cricket to make the point. Cricket is an international sport, and the Caribbean has a joint cricket team, unified cricket team. We were once the strongest team in the world. Ironically, we are called the West Indies, and we seem to proudly hold on to that name, forgetting that this is a name given to us by our colonizers, having very little knowledge of the geography, ended up in this part of the world thinking that they got to the Indies. And rather than face the facts that they were not in the Indies, they held on to the name and just put the West to it. So they came to the West Indies. Now, we go to England, we have bilateral series. So we go to England to play cricket, generally often April through June. This is their summer months. But colleagues, for anybody who have gone to the UK, and for me from the Caribbean, these months are not at all warm. These are very cold and rainy months. And you're playing a sport. This is a sport that is played over 5 days. So it's a long game, 5 days or 5 to 6 hours per day. Our Caribbean players end up on the cricket field, and quite often you see them with their hands in their pockets. And you'll hear the English commentators speaking about them as if they are not interested. How could you be on a cricket field with your hands in your pocket? You know, cannot look through the frames of a Caribbean person and realize that they are cold, they're warm in their hands, even though when the play is ready, their hands are out of the pockets, they're alert, they're ready to go. That's not how they're seeing it. They're seeing it through their frames that these months are not so cold. They're accustomed to it, of course, but a Caribbean person who's not accustomed to it, they just cannot envisage that it is a level of discomfort for them. So colleagues, we see things through our own frames, and with it come perception biases. So you have bias of language, because if you speak standard English and you're hearing a different language, a so-called dialect, you may not take kindly to it. You come to do research, the culture is different from yours, but you're interpreting it through your culture. You have a different education system, and that encroach on how you interpret the educational data, and you come with your own philosophies. That is the Western frame. So what do they see when they come to the Caribbean? They often see small island states, and even the countries of the Caribbean that are on the South American or Central American mainland, they still see them as small countries with small population. They see their colonial history, and with that colonial history, they see us as people who are dependent, mendicants, even beggars. They see us as a broken region that they can fix. So they come in to do that research with those perceptions and thinking that, oh, the research that I do, the interpretations that I make is going to help to fix a broken wheel. So when they come in to do this research, then there's some methodological challenges that are presented. I like to speak about the insider-outsider, the emic-etic conundrum. And it's not that one is better than the other. And I'm not at all advocating that research cannot be done in a region by outsiders, but that you have to realize that there are certain conundrums that exist. You have the insider view versus the outsider view. And in research, there's a saying, make strange that which is familiar. So if you're part of the research context, to do it objectively, make strange, be objective, make strange that which is familiar. But the conundrum is that it says also, make familiar that which is strange. So you come in as an outsider, you have to make the context familiar. So what is the Caribbean reality for the insider-outsider? We are small states. But with small states comes something very interesting. One person quite often wear multiple hats. So the example that I like to use is that I'm from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I work at the University of the West Indies in Barbados, 2 different islands. Quite often, I do work for the Ministry of Education. I go into the country, sit with the Ministry of Education, help to shape policy and so forth. We have discussions. So I'm known in my country, even though I'm living outside, as somebody who does work with the Ministry of Education, with the college. I'm actually the chair of the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Community College Board. But there are times when I go into that space to do research, and I go in as an outsider from the university. So here I am, supposedly that etic person coming in with that outside lens, going into a space where they do not see me as an outsider. They see me with emic views. You're coming to do research, but I know you do work with the Ministry of Education. You do stuff with the college. And so there can be a certain level of distrust. So sometimes when you think you're etic, you're not quite etic, you're still emic. So researcher participants are aware of my involvement in the research, of the formulation of policy and practice, and they may become guarded because who am I? Am I the researcher or am I linked to the Ministry of Education? So those are some of the things that you grapple with in small states and small regions like the Caribbean. And then from another perspective, when it comes to emic-etic, the Caribbean reality, when the researcher is from outside, meaning from a Western country, participants may talk to the researcher But as Peter Roberts pointed out, they do so with ambiguities and ambivalence because they're distrustful. So they're not quite given straight factual answers. As we say, there's a saying, we speak through both corners of our mouths. So you're not quite sure what is the message, but the outside researcher who does not understand that believes that they're getting facts from the person, when in truth and in fact, the participant is suspicious, guarded, using guarded language, and which may be misinterpreted by that researcher. So what happens when those researchers come in, that ethic researcher, that person from the UK, from the US, from places like that, from Canada, they come to the Caribbean, they're interviewing somebody, they may hear halting language, jerky language, a bit laborious. They may hear the misuse of some English words. They may see lack of eye contact, which is somewhat cultural. Depends on your social class. You might find you're not looking a person directly in the eyes. There's research on that. Participants are looking away. And as a result, the interpretation that is given by that external researcher is that that person lacks knowledge of the phenomenon, or that they have weak cognitive processes. They're not quite bright. They're not intelligent. When in truth, the reality is that the participants are trying to use the perceived language of the researcher. Because our official language is English, even though our home language, our first languages are Creoles, some form of Creole, whether it's an English-based Creole or French-based Creole or vernacular of English, we are taught to believe that our language is standard English. So when a person comes in, the first thing the participants will do is to, out of respect sometimes, is to switch to an estimate of that standard English. And naturally, it is not their first language. So it is not spoken as fluently as if they were speaking the language of their home. Caribbean people tend to get formal when they have visitors. And not only when they have visitors, but if they distrust a situation or just do not have a complete understanding, and they switch to what they perceive to be the high language. We know all languages are equal linguistically, but in sociolinguistics, there's something called diglossia, where there is a perception that there is a high language and a low language. In the Caribbean, the high language is perceived to be standard English, and the low language perceived to be the Creole or the vernacular. So another challenge is data, how data is analyzed. So we have, for example, international data collected all around the world. And I'm using one that I write frequently about. I take their data and analyze. The OECD PISA data, that's where they test 15-year-olds across OECD countries and other countries in the world. Trinidad and Tobago is the only country in the Caribbean that has taken on this assessment. But when you look at the assessment in Trinidad and you look at the results, Trinidad performs, generally speaking, below the OECD countries. And in the OECD countries, it should be known that these countries, students are tested in official languages. So in the US, it would be English. Whether the child in the US is a Spanish speaker originally or French speaker, they'll be tested in English. In other countries, like France, will be tested in French and so forth. Now, there are studies on this PISA data that show, and we use Singapore as an example, when you look at the results of children who say they do not speak English at home, but they're tested in English, their performance is significantly below those of students who say they speak English at home. So how does that affect Trinidad? Now, in the case of Trinidad, all the 15-year-olds are saying English is their language because that's what we have been taught. So they're tested in English. And the results does not take into consideration that English is not our first language. So we are saying, in interpreting data like this, you cannot just interpret it through Western frames. You have to know the context. You have to know that many of the children in Trinidad and Tobago, their first language is a Creole, English-based Creole. That Trinidad is right next door to Venezuela, and that there are large student populations that are from Venezuela, so that English is their first language, and so forth. So these are considerations in our writings that we say you should take into account. That quite often, when the OECD does its interpretation of the data, they do that in a sterile way through their Western frames without giving consideration to that context. And as I come to an end, conducting educational research in the Caribbean, some biases associated with Western frames, some things that we should bear in mind, that when they come, they should try to remember that the smallness of the space and the population can lead to some bias. That when you think you're collecting a certain type of data, this person is giving you information, knowing that because of the smallness, I may be able to be identified. So they're reluctant in giving you the truth because they do not want to be identified with what they have said. They should pay attention to colonial history, a history that has really impeded what we do in the name of education, that we are not making the kind of progress that we should make, and that how things appear is not what it always is. That in the Caribbean, we proudly say we have a British education system and we feel so proud of it, but it's an education that is failing most people. The language situation, you have to be aware of the language situation in the region, knowing that standard English is not our first language. And you have to understand the tendency to value things from outside over homegrown, so that when you come and you say certain things, people can listen and lap it up, even though it is not true, and then want to implement something that is not the best for us. So I'm saying we want to eliminate the biases, because with those biases, that kind of research, it renders our students, our teachers, our education system, our ministries of education almost voiceless and helpless. Quite often we do not see it. But when you read to see how we are portrayed in international arena, in the journals and so forth, we really seem to have no voice. And we are hoping that that more value can be paid to local solutions. So colleagues, I am saying conducting educational research in the Caribbean using Western frames does not work. Yes, traditions of research developed in Western societies have contributed useful guidelines for conducting research in the Caribbean, but it has not produced a model that is the best fit for the region. For that to happen, you have to ask the people in the region and listen to their answers, not through Western ears, not that understand the history, that do not understand the history, nor the culture, nor the ambiguities and ambivalence, nor the legacies of their colonial past. We cannot do it through those frames. We have to ask the ones who are actually carrying the bag of salt, and then we have to listen to them. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Guarican. C'est vraiment un plaisir d'écouter votre présentation, surtout par rapport à ce sujet de la colonisation, parce que c'est un sujet absolument transversal, je dirais. J'ai réfléchi dans mon pays, le Chili, avec les indigènes, par exemple, et surtout ce que vous parlez il y a une phrase que vous avez dit que ça m'a touché spécialement, que c'est sortir les filtres occidentaux, sortir les filtres occidentaux pour pouvoir faire la recherche. C'est tellement important de pouvoir comprendre les contextes, les territoires pour pouvoir faire une recherche profonde et réaliste. Donc, je vous remercie énormément et à la fin de cette panel, on aura un moment de discussion où on peut répondre à questions du public et pouvoir un moment de dialogue. Merci encore, Dr. Warrican. Maintenant, je veux présenter Aline, qui aujourd'hui nous accompagne avec une présentation qui s'intitule « INE et l'agent d'apprentissage, mise en réseau et soutien de la recherche ». Elle sera présentée par Sonja Anderson. Elle est responsable du travail d'examen et de renforcement de la base de données prouvant pour l'éducation dans les situations d'urgence. Elle est coordinatrice. Elle coordonne les différents domaines de travail sur les preuves au sein de l'INE. Sonja est titulaire d'une maîtrise en éducation de l'Université de Harvard dans le domaine de la politique éducative internationale. Elle est également titulaire d'une licence en relations internationales de l'Université de San Francisco. Et aussi sera présente Nathalie Bienfait. Elle soutient les actions de communication de la communauté française linguistique et soutient également la communication du programme de l'Agence belge de développement pour l'éducation à la citoyenneté mondiale. Elle est titulaire d'un master en sciences politiques et en action humanitaire et d'un master avancé en droit de l'homme. Merci beaucoup, Sonja et Nathalie.
Merci beaucoup, Maciel. Merci à toutes et tous. Avant tout, je voudrais vous présenter des excuses parce que je suis actuellement en train de voyager, donc mon écran risque de bouger un peu. Je vais donc vous présenter l'INE, le réseau interagence pour l'éducation en situation d'urgence, et Sonia continuera la présentation pour tout ce qui est notre travail de données et recherche. Donc, l'INE, qu'est-ce que c'est avant tout? L'INE, c'est un réseau interagence, donc de plusieurs personnes venant d'agences des Nations Unies, d'ONG, de donateurs, de gouvernements, d'universités, de personnel enseignant, de personnel, enfin des apprenants et des populations également qui sont touchées par des crises. Alors, nous avons comme plus de 18 000 membres qui font partie de plus de 4 000 organisations représentées dans 190 pays. L'INE existe avant tout par et pour ses membres. Donc, c'est vraiment un travail de mise en réseau de l'éducation en situation. Le principal, c'est donc de garantir le droit à l'éducation pertinente, sûre et de qualité pour toutes les personnes qui sont confrontées à une situation d'urgence à travers un travail de prévention, de préparation et d'intervention, mais également de relèvement après une crise. Pour ce faire, donc pour réaliser cette mission, nous avons un cadre stratégique, 4 stratégies principales, donc qui est de procurer un leadership éclairé et un plaidoyer global. Nous travaillons vraiment pour mettre en coordination des différents praticiens et praticiennes pour défendre ce droit à l'éducation, même dans les situations d'urgence. Ensuite, la deuxième, c'est renforcer la capacité à offrir à tous et toutes une éducation de qualité sûre, pertinente et équitable. La troisième stratégie qui est apporter, gérer et organiser les connaissances en vue d'informer sur les politiques et les pratiques. Donc là, on va se retrouver tout notre travail pour renforcer la base des données probantes, rechercher les preuves dans les différents contextes dans lesquels travaillent les personnes membres, renforcer et diversifier notre réseau des membres de l'INE parce que nous pensons évidemment que nous pouvons nous enrichir tous des expériences de chacun et chacune et nous valorisons énormément cette diversité du réseau. Alors, les secteurs d'orientation thématique, d'abord, c'est la cohérence entre l'aide humanitaire et le développement. C'est tout un travail aussi de recherche par rapport à cette cohérence. Définition et mesure de la qualité de l'enseignement, la santé mentale et le bien-être, et jeunesse et compétences. Alors, comment nous travaillons? Nous avons plusieurs espaces réseaux, c'est ce que nous appelons. Nous avons donc les communautés de langue, justement. L'INE, la langue officielle, on travaille en anglais et nous avons aussi comme langue officielle l'arabe, le français, l'espagnol et le portugais. Et donc, il y a chaque langue a une communauté de langue avec un facilitateur ou une facilitatrice et une personne pour la communication. Donc, c'est pour renforcer le travail vraiment au niveau de la langue et pour aussi tout le travail de recherche qui soit traduit et s'assurer qu'il puisse être accessible dans différentes langues. Ensuite, nous avons les groupes de travail. là, il y a un groupe de travail les groupes de travail, c'est vraiment un groupe plutôt institutionnel qui regroupe des praticiens de l'éducation en situation d'urgence qui font des recherches sur des domaines thématiques comme les normes et les pratiques, les politiques éducatives et le plaidoyer. Le mandat officiel s'est terminé en mai 2021. Donc, pour l'instant, les groupes de travail ne sont plus actifs. Ils ont néanmoins produit énormément de documents que vous pouvez retrouver sur notre site Internet. Nous avons également des groupes de référence qui sont plutôt à caractère consultatif et qui ont pour ambition de sortir un peu de l'institution et donc sont vraiment composés d'experts techniques internationaux. Et c'est pour aussi donc avoir une consultation vis-à-vis de ces experts pour des domaines spécifiques. Nous avons plusieurs groupes de référence donc sur les données de l'éducation en situation d'urgence, sur l'éducation à distance, nous avons également la bibliothèque des évaluations où nous partageons des évaluations, des outils développés par des organisations, des praticiens et des projets dans le monde, et sur l'éducation aussi pour les femmes, l'éducation inclusive. Nous avons également des groupes de collaboration. Donc ça, ce sont des espaces qui permettent à différents groupes de pouvoir travailler ensemble. Nous avons également un groupe de collaboration pour le personnel enseignant en situation de crise. Donc nous avons un grand travail qui est développé sur le bien-être et sur aussi tout ce qui est développement des capacités professionnelles du personnel enseignant. Nous avons un groupe de travail collaboratif sur le soutien psychosocial et l'apprentissage social et émotionnel. Et nous avons un groupe de collaboration sur tout ce qui est données et preuves. Ensuite, nous avons des équipes de travail oui, spécialisées sur des thématiques. Et là, c'est vraiment donner des opportunités aux membres de vraiment s'engager avec d'autres personnes pour travailler également, développer des connaissances sur différentes thématiques. Donc, il y a sur le genre, sur le développement de la petite enfance, sur l'adolescence et la jeunesse, sur tout ce qui est terminologie, sur la localisation et sur l'éducation inclusive. Alors, nous avons également les normes minimales. Donc, les normes minimales pour une éducation de qualité, c'est un document qui a été développé en 2004. Donc, l'INE existe depuis l'année 2000. Elle a été créée suite à un sommet à Dakar. Et en 2004, les premières normes minimales ont été développées avec un travail de collaboration entre 3500 pédagogues de plus de 52 pays. Et elle a pour ambition de vraiment mettre des bases qui permettent donc de développer cet accès à l'éducation. Elles ont été mises à jour en 2010 et nous sommes actuellement en train de les mettre à jour également. Je vais vous expliquer plus c'est quoi les normes minimales. Elles sont basées sur donc et donc pour présenter des objectifs universels pour aider les adultes et les enfants à obtenir le droit de vivre dignement. Elles s'alignent aussi avec les nouvelles de l'année prochaine. Alors, les normes minimales de l'INE il y en a en tout. Les normes
on a quelques problèmes techniques, donc peut-être songe si tu veux continuer la présentation parce que Nathalie, il y avait des difficultés. Donc, je te donne la parole, peut-être c'est mieux pour tous.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in if that's helpful. I know that I think Natalie was maybe sharing slides. It looks like you're back now.
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you,
we'll
Sonia.
let you wrap up. Yep, and then I'll come in. Thank you,
I
Natalie.
got disconnected.
No problem. Oh, I think you're on mute now.
C'est ton micro, Nathalie. Je ne sais pas si tu es en train de parler.
Désolée, j'arrivais pas à trouver le bouton du micro. Les aléas de la technologie. Donc, nous avons les normes fondamentales qui sont la participation communautaire, la coordination et l'analyse, accès et environnement d'apprentissage, enseignement et apprentissage, enseignants et autres personnels d'éducation et les politiques éducatives. Donc ça, ce sont les normes qui sont donc le pourquoi. Ensuite, nous avons, donc, elles sont qualitatives, applicables dans tout type d'environnement. En plus, donc, dans chaque norme, il y a des actions clés. Donc, c'est le quoi, comment pouvoir réaliser cette norme. Donc, ce sont des propositions de mesures afin de pouvoir atteindre ou de marcher vers cette norme, d'arriver vers l'objectif que l'on souhaite réaliser. Et ensuite, chaque norme, après ces actions clés, a des notes d'orientation qui est le comment. Donc, ça rassemble des éléments de bonne pratique à considérer lors de l'application des normes minimales et lors de l'adaptation des actions clés dans différentes situations. Alors, le guide des normes minimales de l'INE est disponible dans plus de 25 langues, si je ne me trompe pas, et il a également été contextualisé dans différents contextes. Donc, c'est un document de base avec des normes partagées, mais ensuite, nous valorisons énormément le fait que ces normes doivent être mises en contexte pour chaque pays, chaque territoire qui a ses particularités, justement, et aussi nous valorisons énormément la diversité des langues, donc pour cela, nous faisons des travaux de traduction importants. N'hésitez pas à nous écrire si vous souhaitez adapter les normes minimales au contexte de vos pays également. Alors ça, c'est aussi pour vous montrer les publications que réalisent les différents groupes de travaux. Donc, il y a aussi un cadre des indicateurs qui a été publié l'année dernière, qui sont des indicateurs exemples pour pouvoir vous aider lors de l'élaboration de vos projets. Il y a aussi tout un travail qui est en train d'être développé sur l'éducation inclusive et notamment sur la dimension du genre à mettre en application dans l'éducation en situation d'urgence. L'éducation en situation de conflit, nous venons également de publier une boîte à outils pour le plaidoyer pour l'éducation en situation d'urgence. Tous ces rapports, tous ces documents de plaidoyer, tous ces documents de données sont disponibles gratuitement sur notre site internet. Il suffit d'aller sur le site de l'INE.org et dans les collections, vous pouvez chercher tout ce qui pourrait vous intéresser et tout est gratuit. Alors, nous avons également un service d'assistance en ligne. Ça, c'est pour les personnes, les praticiens, praticiennes qui travaillent également dans le secteur donc, de l'éducation en situation d'urgence qui ont des soucis techniques. Ils peuvent nous consulter et nous aurons à répondre dans les 24 heures. Je ne vais pas approfondir, on va laisser le temps à celui-là. Ensuite, nous avons la communauté de pratique. Ça, c'est aussi un espace d'échange entre membres du réseau que nous avons lancé il y a tout juste un an. Ça s'est basé sur Slack. Slack, c'est une messagerie comme Telegram ou comme WhatsApp. Donc, ça permet de mettre des personnes en communication. Tous les membres de l'INE peuvent donc rejoindre la communauté de pratique et elle est divisée en plusieurs canaux de communication selon des thématiques ou des pays ou des langues. Et vous pouvez également créer, si vous souhaitez, un canal pour votre pays, par exemple. Il existe donc une thématique évidemment sur les données et les preuves et sur la bibliothèque des évaluations et sur la recherche. Et ça, ça permet donc justement de partager et de aussi pouvoir vous rencontrer d'autres personnes, membres de l'INE, qui peuvent éventuellement vous aider dans vos recherches. Et dans autre initiative que je souhaite vous présenter, c'est les points focaux que nous avons lancés et renforcés la mise en réseau au niveau local des pays latine et Caraïbes. Nous avons quelqu'un en Bolivie, au Venezuela, en Haïti, en Colombie, en Brésil et au Mexique. Et donc, ce sont des personnes qui représentent l'INE au niveau des pays qui permettent donc de faciliter ces échanges d'informations. Je vais maintenant passer la parole à Sonia qui va continuer pour développer notre travail de recherche et de preuve de l'INE. Merci.
Thank you, Natalie, so much. And I will be presenting in English, so apologies. I know the interpretation is fantastic because I've been listening to the other languages. But first, I just wanted to thank Suma Kicks for the opportunity to speak and connect with you all today. And a sincere thanks as well to Dr. Warakan for the important and critical presentation. I think we could take an entire day or more to discuss, of course. And I wish that we had the time to really focus on those issues of decolonizing knowledge, but I really appreciate your presentation. So as Natalie's been sharing, we're obviously taking a slightly more kind of global scope in ours and hopefully introducing you to INE as a network that is a resource for all of you engaging in research, in education and emergencies, and in education more broadly. So I'm going to share a little bit about a few specific initiatives that we have around data and evidence that I think could be beneficial for you. INE, of course, is a network that is led by and working to support its members. So a priority for us moving forward is, of course, localizing knowledge production and dissemination, and working to better connect with and serve regional and national stakeholders in the restructure, which I believe Natalie mentioned as well. So just a few points, and then we'll wrap up, because I know we've been presenting for some time now. Our work around data and evidence is driven by our strategic priority 3. I won't read through each of these actions and outcomes, but this is really our overarching framework that guides our work in this area. Next slide, please. And one of the primary resources, next slide, is the E-Cubed Research Fund. So this was a $10 million US fund over 5 years between 2017 and 2021. Unfortunately, we've just wrapped up the 5th and final call for proposals in this iteration of the fund, but we are actively seeking support to continue with E-Cubed, not this year, but hopefully in years to come. And this fund aimed to generate and disseminate relevant and usable research that contributes to knowledge and practice, with the aim of supporting education during crises and large-scale disruptions. We were really prioritizing research led by or inclusive of academics and practitioners in crisis-affected contexts. And within this program, INE managed the proposal submission, review, and research dissemination processes, as well as convening a grantee learning community, while Dubai Cares, who is the funder of this 10 million USD fund, made final funding decisions and managed ongoing grants once funds were distributed. So as I mentioned, we did wrap up our 5th and final call. We will be engaging in an evaluation of the research fund and including this in our recommendations of how the fund might move forward, but not an immediate resource, but hopefully in the future, again, something to look out for. I think this is unique in the sector as a fund that priorities are not identified or driven by global north institutions. We look for research being proposed from communities affected by conflict and crisis, who we believe are best placed to identify research priorities. Next slide, please. The second initiative that I wanted to mention is the INE Learning Agenda. So this is a process that we began in 2017 and 2018, holding a series of regional and global consultations to identify existing evidence gaps. So we brought together academics and practitioners in 3 regional consultations in Bogota, Dhaka, and Amman, as well as in a global scope in New York, really to understand what the critical evidence gaps were in these contexts, as well as gaps in types of evidence, and then to map ongoing or emerging research projects or partnerships. So understanding that as a sector, we don't always do the best job in sharing research before it's finalized. So we want to be able to share ongoing research so that other funders of research or researchers are not engaging in similar research and duplicating efforts. And then also, of course, just support dissemination of research once it is produced. This, if you go to the next slide, this information will be collected and housed on an evidence platform that INE is currently developing, which will again be a place for us to map those critical evidence gaps across contexts. And for us, we've organized those gaps by the minimum standards domains, as Natalie mentioned. We also have them organized thematically. And then to also interact with existing research around these specific evidence gaps. And we will engage in a yearly process to revise these evidence gaps. So to validate them if they are still existing, or to revise and include new evidence gaps as they emerge. So again, the evidence platform is under development, but once it is live, we're hoping towards the end of the year, hopefully it will be a strong resource for all stakeholders that are engaging in kind of knowledge production and use in the education and emergency sector. Next slide, please. Finally, well, not finally, I will be showing one more initiative, but the Journal on Education in Emergencies hopefully is a resource that you are all well aware of. INEE supports the journal specifically in kind of the dissemination side of things. The journal is, of course, led by and also housed at NYU under Dr. Dana Birdie. The journal aims to publish rigorous scholarly and applied work, stimulate research and debate, promote learning across service delivery organizations, academic institutions, and policymakers, and define knowledge gaps and key trends. And it is surely a resource for those of you that are hoping to publish your research, to submit articles or case studies to the journal. Sometimes there are specific calls for content around a specific thematic area, and sometimes we have more general EIE focused issues. So again, just highlighting a resource also, of course, to read as a fantastic way of staying up to date on key evidence in our sector. Next slide. And the final initiative that INEE has, that these are amongst a variety of others, so I'm just highlighting these four, that I do think is a useful resource, is a network space that we have around data in education and emergencies. So this is a group that we convened in 2020. It's co-chaired by UNESCO, UIS, and ECW, the Education Cannot Wait Fund. And it has identified a number of functions for itself around strategy development and review, capacity development, resource mobilization, knowledge sharing and co-creation of solutions, and norm setting and advocacy. Next slide, around a few specific work streams. So these work streams have been identified by a consultation that we held in 2019 in Geneva with key EIE data stakeholders, to really try and set kind of an action agenda for us moving forward to strengthen the data ecosystem. So there are primary areas of work in the data reference group around global data reporting, data sharing, analysis, and use, strengthening joint monitoring, evaluation, and learning towards collective outcomes, and then data standards. All of this information is available on the INEE website. And if you're interested or want to learn more beyond what's available there, I would encourage you to reach out to myself. I'd be happy to discuss if you're interested in getting involved in this network space specifically. It is open. Definitely also encourage all of you to become INEE members. It's free if you are not already a member of INEE. So I hope that we've been able to highlight some potentially useful resources for those of you participating, and really encourage you to follow up if you do have questions. And I think Natalie is just going to speak to one more slide that we have. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup Sonia pour cette grande présentation rapide de ce travail. Donc pour terminer, en fait, nous voulions, quand nous avons fait cette réflexion sur la participation de l'INE et comment l'INE pouvait aussi soutenir le travail de la recherche en Amérique latine et aux Caraïbes, nous avons réfléchi à quelques questions auxquelles nous voulions lancer pour éventuellement en débat. C'est identifier le pourquoi parfois il y avait donc cette lacune dans l'accès aux données dans l'éducation en situation d'urgence. Et nous avons pensé à la prédominance de l'anglais dans la recherche toujours actuellement, la complexité du contexte des Caraïbes, comment pouvons-nous encourager la recherche en français et quelles sont les opportunités de recherche dans vos pays. Donc peut-être pouvons-nous en débattre prochainement ou après. Si vous avez des questions, n'hésitez pas à nous les écrire. Donc voici l'adresse de l'INE. Le site internet de l'INE est donc dans les 5 langues et vous pouvez donc rejoindre gratuitement, comme l'a très bien dit Sonia, et nous serons heureux de vous y retrouver. Merci Martial, et merci Sonia, et merci à tous et toutes pour nous donner l'opportunité d'être présents.
Merci beaucoup Nathalie, merci beaucoup Sandra, c'est très intéressant le travail que vous venez d'exposer. C'est aussi des initiatives ou des institutions comme la vôtre, c'est très important pour précisément ce que nous on essaie d'encourager. C'est la recherche, la participation, la diffusion, et aussi ça sera génial, comme a dit tout à l'heure le Dr. Warrican, de pouvoir le faire sans cette fouloir dans les yeux de l'occidental, mais voilà, on est là pour discuter de tout ça, donc je vous remercie. Et à la fin de cette panel, on aura un moment de discussion et de répondre aux questions, donc peut-être Nathalie, tu peux répondre aux questions que tu viens de poser. Merci à vous deux. Et maintenant, on va continuer pour la troisième présentation de cette panel, qui est menée par les Kixlax, par Raúl Chacón. C'est le directeur de Kixlat. Il est sociologue de l'Université catholique du Chili et titulaire d'une maîtrise en études pédagogiques de l'Université Concordia à Montréal, Canada. Et aussi par moi-même, Maciel Morales. Je suis chercheuse du KIX. J'ai un doctorat en sciences de l'éducation de l'Université Paris 5 de Sorbonne, une maîtrise en sciences de l'éducation et esthétique histoire des arts de l'Université Paris 8. On va présenter une communication intitulée Perspectives des enseignants sur la pandémie, pratiques, défis et apprentissage. Je donne la parole à Raoul Chacón.
Thank you, Maciel. Thanks to Dr. Warwick and Sonia, Natalie. It's really great to hear these presentations. In honor to time, we'll try to do it as quick as possible, because of course we have a very interesting panel after this one. So I will start giving thanks to IDRC, our partners on this endeavor. OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, is with us today. GP, of course, the Global Partnership for Education, and in this opportunity as well, the IENEE, which is with us co-organizing this colloquium. Of course, all of you, and the special greetings to our colleagues from the KICS countries. Just a brief slide that many of you already know about SUMA and KICS. We are the first education, research, and innovation laboratory for Latin America and the Caribbean. We are leading together with the OECS this KICS Knowledge and Innovation Exchange Initiative for Latin America and the Caribbean, and we share this mission related to the promotion of the right to education, quality, equity, and inclusion in our education systems through the mobilization of evidence to support informed decision-making processes at the local levels, but also at the structural national levels as well. As I said, we work with focus on some GPE country partners, which are Dominica, El Salvador, Grenada, Guatemala, Guyana, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Specifically, we are working really close with representatives from all the countries. But at the same time, we're working beyond, and we work with the region, and also we really like to bring the global perspective as well. So it's so interesting to hear the discussion about the mobilization of knowledge, evidence, and what does it mean, how we can address and use those evidence critically, appropriated, analyzing those findings, etc. So for that, we define three main objectives that are the main pillars of our work, really brief. We work with the policy agenda that comes from the countries, and specifically we're discussing these days, this last month, and we're continuing with that about teacher professional development, the impacts of COVID, and the strengthening of our public education systems. We mobilize knowledge for that. We like to discuss alternative solutions that are coming from outside of the region, but are from inside as well. So that's the critical perspective that we like to promote as well. And of course, we know that we need to foster capacity building. In this case, it's so important to discuss about the capabilities that we have within the region on research specifically. Today we will focus and we will share the presentation with Maciel. I'll give the first part. about an interesting effort initiative that we implemented together with the IDRC, GBE, and our colleagues from OECS in the countries in our region. We wanted to hear the voice of the teachers regarding about the effects or the perceptions they have in these days of pandemics. So some characteristic of the sample reached, we were really surprised with the participation. More than 200,000 teachers respond the questionnaire. The total here is 192,000 teachers is the valid information that we are using for for presenting these findings. So the high participation is the first thing that we would like to mention, and then the implementation. The survey was implemented between May and September, and we are now starting to present those findings. Of course, and it's really important to highlight the collaboration with ministries of education. This is on 21 countries. In the case of the Eastern Caribbean states, we work directly with OECS, and together we reach the countries. We work not only in dissemination, but also discussing the instrument, the pertinence of the questionnaire that we were implementing. So we will be sharing all of this very soon. We're almost finishing the report, but we have already some findings about it, and there are many opportunities to deepen the analysis at both at the national and regional levels. Some countries have quite interesting numbers of teachers. In the case of OECS member states, we have the group of countries from the islands, and almost 800 teachers responded there. So one flag here is the red flag is that this is not representative survey. So this is a voluntary survey that almost 200,000 teachers responded. So there are interesting trends to analyze and to wait, of course, what those findings are saying. Many dimensions, some of the characteristics of the institutions, the teachers, but also others related to the challenges faced during the pandemic in terms of the pedagogical practices that teachers are using with the students, the relationships, and something really important, the well-being of teachers and students as well. In terms of gender, really quick, this is at the regional level. The sample reached almost more than 70% was female. In terms of the dependency of the teachers, the schools, most of them are coming from public schools. As you can see, in the case of the socioeconomic status of students, in average, more than 73% of the students are from medium, low, and low socioeconomic status, and that's really to have an idea of what we are discussing today. And what is interesting is that at the moment of when the teachers respond the survey, more than 73% of them, here are the totals of the teachers, were declared that they did distance education, and another not minor is like 22% responded they did it in a hybrid way. So that's the composition of the survey. There are a few things about the students that we would like to highlight. The risk of exclusion in perception of the teachers is really hiked. The proportion of teachers, more than 50, almost 57% of the teachers that are highlighting this alert regarding to students. Regarding to learning loss, there is another interesting and alarming declaration that teachers are doing. In their perception, on average, only 7% believe that their students are not falling behind their learning. So it's important to highlight that 27% of the teachers are declaring that more than half of the students are behind. So this is something that we would like to highlight as well today. And another important thing regarding to the difficulties that the majority of the students would be facing in distance learning are related to, of course, as you can imagine, connectivity, internet problems, lacking electronic resources, and this is more pronounced in when we control by socioeconomic status, as you can see. But also, and this is important in Summa, we as we were mentioning regarding the understanding of the human right as education as a human right, we need to not only see the biggest trends, but also to analyze what is happening. And we would like to concentrate the discussion as well in terms of what the teachers are saying, in terms of the problems that the students are facing. So the problems of motivation or depression are quite high. Interestingly, apparently there are not that many differences between socioeconomic status. And the other one, which is more alarming even, are the situations of domestic violence. More than 12% of the teachers that respond to the survey are declaring that there are situations of violence here. Regarding teachers, and then I will pass the floor to Maciel. Regarding teachers' labor satisfaction, we ask about their feeling about it, and they in general they are declaring satisfaction. They are satisfied or very satisfied in general, I would say. But here we would like to highlight those elements that appear less, where there is less satisfaction, and it's related to salary, something that we push, we foster when we say the teachers are at the core of the work we're doing in education. We understand that other regions, when we look at the OECD member states, we can say that we will continue supporting this agenda as well, of course, and it relates to investment in our people. And finally, before Maciel takes the floor, we would like to highlight the main concerns of teachers by gender. And this is when you see, in general, you can see that the most mentioned are related to health. We're in pandemic, so we've been living through tough times, personal and family health. But then we would like to highlight the differences in gender, specifically in terms of the excessive amount of work, where females are much more concerned about it than males. And then regarding to the distribution of time between housework and work. So it's something that we have read already as some of the results of the pandemic, but here we are corroborating some with evidence, some kind of this kind of trends. So as quick as I could, Maciel, please, I give you the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, merci beaucoup, Raoul. Moi aussi, je vais essayer de passer assez vite. C'est beaucoup d'informations, c'est complètement intéressant. Donc, quand on a demandé aux professeurs par rapport au programme d'études abordé, en fonction des statuts socio-économiques des élèves, on a demandé en ce qui concerne votre groupe actuel des étudiants. Ça, c'est la question, non? Dans quelle mesure considérez-vous que les contenus définis dans les programmes d'études ont été abordés ou couverts de manière satisfaisante? Et il y avait une échelle de 1 à 5 où 1, c'était pas du tout, et 5, c'était entièrement traité. Raoul, si tu peux changer la diapo, s'il te plaît. Donc ici, c'était assez intéressant parce que comme vous pouvez voir, il y a des différences entre les niveaux socio-économiques des professeurs qui ont répondu et aussi l'administration. Vous savez que presque dans toute l'Amérique latine et Caraïbes, peut-être, il y a des écoles non privées, subventionnées et publiques. Donc, ce que nous voudrions dire par rapport à ces résultats, c'est que la tendance est assez claire. Les programmes d'études couverts, ils diminuent en fonction de statut socio-économique. C'est-à-dire, c'est clair que les personnes d'un statut socio-économique inférieur ont réussi à couvrir beaucoup moins de contenu que les programmes de niveau supérieur. Et ici, il y a une relation par rapport au système privé et public. Et bien évidemment, il faut être très clair que les professeurs de niveau public, il y a des défis beaucoup plus forts par rapport à faire les cours que les professeurs du système privé. Par rapport à la dynamique des priorisations des programmes d'études, on a demandé comment la priorisation des contenus a été développée. Ici, c'est super intéressant les résultats, car les pourcentages plus hauts par rapport à l'éducation à distance, c'était faire des accords entre les professeurs. Ça, c'est les réponses plus élevées. Mais aussi, par exemple, les faire de façon individuelle. Aussi, il y avait un pourcentage assez haut, non? 40% à distance. Et aussi, les professeurs qui disent qu'ils ont reçu des orientations de l'équipe directive, c'est aussi assez bas ce pourcentage. Donc, nous pouvons parler ici que peut-être il y a un manque de soutien de les directions ou de les gouvernements par rapport à ce qu'il fallait prioriser pour les curriculums. Et pour cette raison, les professeurs soit ont dû de se mettre d'accord entre eux ou de les faire de façon individuelle. Et quand on a demandé par rapport à ces stratégies de rattrapage des apprentissages, non, on a demandé c'est quelles les stratégies qui ont mis actuellement pour niveler les apprentissages des élèves. Donc ici, on voit que les stratégies les plus utilisées, c'est le travail individuel des élèves et aussi les diagnostics. Ici, c'est aussi intéressant de réfléchir comment les professeurs, avec toute la charge qu'on sait qu'on a, on a réussi à faire un travail individuel avec chaque élève. Après, on a demandé les outils, non? Les outils pour l'enseignement à distance. Et la question, c'était avec quelle fréquence utilisez-vous les outils suivants pour mener vos cours hybrides à distance? La suivante, s'il te plaît. Donc ici, quand c'était assez espérable, les plateformes digitales, numériques, ont un rôle très important. Non? Et on peut souligner, bien sûr, les cours en ligne, l'utilisation des ressources numériques comme YouTube et des autres plateformes, et aussi des ressources digitales variées. Malgré ça, c'est très intéressant de voir que les matériels imprimés, les papiers, et aussi des médias de communication comme la télé et la radio sont aussi assez utilisés. Donc, ça aussi, le numérique, c'est assez important, bien évidemment, mais dans les territoires comme les nôtres, ce n'est pas le seul. Au moment qu'on a demandé les niveaux de préparation des enseignants à la formation à distance, nous pouvons voir des différences intéressantes par rapport au pays en ce qui concerne l'autoperception des professeurs. Non? On voit des différences importantes dans chaque pays dès s'ils se sentent préparés ou pas. Et aussi, on peut souligner qu'il y a un pourcentage assez haut des professeurs qui déclarent se sentir préparés pour les cours à distance. Et finalement, quand on a demandé par rapport à les difficultés dans l'exercice de leur fonction dans l'enseignement, et bien évidemment, les difficultés les plus grandes, on va dire, ça continue, les problèmes de connectivité des étudiants, l'accès à l'Internet. Mais il y a un donné qui attire notre attention et qu'on voudrait aussi mettre l'accent, c'est par rapport à la manque de motivation et le décrochage des élèves. Ça, c'est un point vraiment clé si on réfléchit à comment améliorer l'éducation, comment réussir à que les élèves et les professeurs sont dans une bonne ambiance et motivés pour faire les cours. Donc, on voudrait aussi destaquer cette donnée. Et maintenant, je redonne la parole à Raoul pour les perspectives finales. Raoul?
Thanks, Marcel. Just to finalize with a few words and reflections about what we're presenting. Definitely, we see opportunities for future analysis and research. So that's the first thing that we would like to highlight. There is a rich data coming here that could be used at the local, national, regional level. The data sets are going to be shared as well. So opportunities there are some qualitative analysis that could be done even with the survey, but to go deep in the analysis. Some specific contributions that we would like to highlight is the need to ensure access and quality education, responding these problems that we identified as lack of motivation, depression of students, risk of exclusion, dropout, situations of violence is something that we really would like to highlight. Of course, the well-being of teachers and students are at the core of our efforts in the educational system. So to reinforce that idea as well. In this new era, we are highlighting as well the pedagogical use of the information and communication technologies as a necessary tool for these new scenarios. More focused on investment and training, we want to highlight. Strengthening teacher support system is something that we have been working the KICS in SUMA with OECS as well. The discussion about the career conditions, the professional development, in-service, pre-service, and of course, there are many challenges there as well. And finally, we would like to reinforce the need for strengthening the public education systems in our region, and especially in those disadvantaged populations that are at the core of our work. Well, thank you very much, and let's continue this conversation and other presentations.
Merci beaucoup, Raoul, et merci à tous les chercheurs et chercheuses de cette première panel. C'était vraiment intéressant. Et je voudrais faire une première question. Bon, c'est deux questions avec une grande question. Et pour ouvrir la conversation, parce qu'en écoutant les présentations, je pensais approfondir sur les défis de la recherche dans la région. Par exemple, ce qui parlait le docteur Guarican, ce qu'Eline a exposé et nous-mêmes, non? Donc, la question, c'est par rapport à ce qu'on vient de parler et par rapport à votre expérience, quels sont les mécanismes ou les stratégies les plus pertinents que vous imaginez la recherche dans la région? En réfléchissant aussi par rapport à la discussion qu'il y avait dans le chat, c'est des recherches où il n'y a pas de préjugement, non? Où il n'y a pas cette imposition occidentale. Donc, comment nous, on peut améliorer, comment on peut créer des espaces où on peut faire des recherches participatives et territoriales? Voilà. Je ne sais pas si peut-être, Dr. Guarican, vous voulez commencer?
Yes, thanks a lot, Marcel. Now, the challenge, so we talk about the Western frames and the constraints that we have when research is done through these Western lenses. And the question is always asked, so how do we combat that? You know, I think that's really the heart of the thing. How do we combat it? I believe that we have got to be very smart and strategic about it. We've got to recognize the world that we are living in, and that we cannot minimize the importance of the Western world. We cannot look at it that we are going, you know, on our own separate ways, because quite often you will be marginalized. So the thing is, how do you use the West to articulate the work that you are doing and to do the work that you want to do. I think that really is the key. And there's some things that I believe that needs to be done. I think the first thing is that it is always good to build a community. And that community can be persons who are local, regional, but there are people in the Western world who very much have an understanding of what we are trying to do and are good allies who we can team up with to work with. So I think it's important that we do not reject persons in the West to work with. Maybe when they have misconceptions, we can help them to clear up those misconceptions and put them on the right path. I think also as we do research, we cannot, and I think I saw Lefranc Joseph mentioned something about how the local the Western frames can still co-opt the local research, and that is very true. So I like to say, do not think that you, a local researcher, is immune from the biases, because many of us have been trained through those same Western frames. We have gone to Western universities, we've gone to the UK, to the US, to France, and so forth to study. And so we have those things embedded in us. So what I encourage is that for us to become reflexive, we need to learn how to reflect on our own practice, on our own way of doing, so we ourselves must be reflexive. One of the things that I've been doing recently, I've been working with some colleagues in the US and Canada, and they have brought me on as a mentor. But I see myself more, these are people from the Caribbean and other non-Western countries. I am serving more as what I call a critical friend to them. So when I read their research, the writing up of their research, or when I look at what they're doing, I'm able to say, have you considered this? Have you considered that? Have you criticizing about the Western world that you yourself is imposing that same thing on your party? So getting a critical friend. And just a few more things. Highlighting issues and challenges in doing your study. So as you write up your study, you have got to be able to share with the Western world that as we did this research in the Caribbean, as we did this research in Latin America, here are some things to consider. Here are some things that we found challenging. Do not know the challenges and not share them. We have got to share.
You're mute, Joel. Your microphone is mute now.
Oh, it just got muted, I imagine.
Yes.
Right. The last thing I would say is that be prepared, colleagues, to use Western mechanisms to get our message. Sometimes when we talk about decolonizing,
again,
I'm not sure. I'm not even touching anything. Yes, sometimes when we try to decolonize, what we do, we end up rejecting everything in the Western world, and we reject their journals, and we try to develop our own journals. It is important that we develop our own journals, but we want to share our work also with them. So we need to be prepared to learn to play the game of the West and get into those journals also, along with our own local journals. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why it's keep muted.
No.
No idea what is happening, just to check.
Merci beaucoup.
No, it's
What is
the
happening
system is
now?
muted. Florencio, can you speak? Because Florencio is asking for the,
Hi.
but I don't know.
No.
Joel, because Joel wanted to wrap up the idea, but it was muted for some reason. Florencio.
Okay, I think the point is really made already, so I'm fine.
Excellent. Thanks, Joel. Florencio, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I wanted to wade into that. I find fascinating discussion on decolonization and research. This is something that, as you know, IDRC faces or struggle with or think about, to put it in positive terms, permanently. Our mandate is to support research done in the South by Southern organizations and bring this knowledge into the global arena. And by doing that, there are many spaces in which the discussion on decolonization is present. And when it comes to how actually you respond to that, I mean, how do you translate this more than valid criticism into something operational? How do you actually do different, considering the framework in which we move in terms of how research today is financed and how some knowledge is validated, whether other is not in practical terms. So this is a question that we face quite often and we discuss quite. What do you do based on that for an organization that overall believes on research and knowledge generated by the South, which is, you can say, anyway, a questionable term, as anyone referring to this sort of separation, I guess. And there are a few things that we have been trying to do. I would like to mention very quickly those, and I also would like to mention some red flags anyway. Yes, at least in KICS, at least in IDRC in general, we have been consistent in the sense that what we are interested is research done in the South and by local organizations. This is not just a political statement. We believe that you do better science when it comes to science related with development and applied science, when this science is done by actors that actually have an understanding more nuanced of the local realities, a more permanent grip and commitment with changing political conditions and policy conditions based on this knowledge, and are able to collect or to consider what local priorities are, which is always difficult to do. We have been trying to do that, for instance, when it comes to our regional grants, by using OECS and SUMA as a way to capture, in an imperfect way, of course, local priorities and national priorities. I think there is also a statement regarding the type of research you can do. Usually the global arena, let's say the large forums, are quite fond of very limited types of research, RCTs in particular, randomized control tests, which are expensive, are long, and not many institutions can afford it. One of our challenges throughout the years has been, how do you give the same status to other type of research results? And I'm thinking, for instance, in more qualitative, applied, ground-based research, participatory research that produce a very important amount of results, but usually the same study is not attributed compared with, like, okay, here is my RCT on that particular topic. And we have been trying to define some strategy. I mean, we have been developing some strategies in order to do that. One of those strategies, for instance, is that we realized that in order to give the same prestige, the same status to local quality research, you need to create some critical mass. So in order to bring that into some debates, you can't just have one case study in each country. You need to bundle together a number of studies that are sort of pointing out on the same directions, all from this sort of more grounded perspective. So I think that that's something important. I'm not saying that all local research or decolonized research or sounder-based research has to do quality. But the matter of fact is that most of this research works on local levels and do not have the same type of resources, and still is good science. And I think that there is also something that Professor Warrican mentioned. It has to do with this idea of open science. Not only open journals or alternative journals to the one that sort of are the most respected or more recognized one. I think that is beyond that, is about how do you actually promote open science? Not only open journals, also open data, and open content and open access to that research. So this is all part of this effort. Now, and with that I will finalize. I think that the risk, and I think that Professor Warrican flagged that or framed that in a good way, is that this distinction that we can theoretically question what exactly means the colonization of that. I think that if you go and do a sort of double click on this, there is an existing debate worldwide on what does it mean, and that debate has changed throughout the last 30, 40 years. But still, I think that what we need to be careful is not to indulge into eliminating standards for this sort of sounder-based, decolonized, let's say, research. How do you make sure that that doesn't turn into sort of anti-science type of discourse? And it's easy for that to happen, and we are facing these sort of discourses in other areas of our development. So I think it's important to still consider how do you make our methods, how do you make our frameworks accountable with good, trustable knowledge, despite everything, so we do not sort of hide beyond this discourse that is absolutely valid and necessary, the need for good quality evidence that can inform local policies in the South. I don't think there is an easy fix of that, but I don't think that it helps to just consider one part of it. So I like a lot what Joel was presenting, if we are able to put it in that framework. That's what I wanted to say, because this is something that, as I said, we have been facing and discussing in IDRC on different areas, not only in education, for a very long time, because it affects the core of what we try to do. Thank you.
You're mute, Marcel.
Merci beaucoup, Florencio, pour ton intervention. Encore c'est moi. Je ne sais pas si peut-être Sonia ou Nathalie, ils voudraient partager une réflexion par rapport à ce qu'on parle maintenant, par rapport à ce sujet de la difficulté ou la façon de faire la recherche.
Sorry, I'm trying to get the question. I heard the difficulties of carrying research, which I don't think I fully understand. So apologies, I'm dealing with the translation a little bit. I don't know if it's possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Désolée. On réfléchit par rapport aux difficultés de la recherche, de faire la recherche dans la région, dans les Caraïbes et l'Amérique centrale, aussi quelles sont les solutions ou les manières de pouvoir approfondir, de pouvoir travailler ensemble pour pouvoir faire cette recherche avec un regard territorial, avec un regard individuel de chaque pays, de chaque caractéristique du pays. Je ne sais pas si je m'exprimais mieux.
Okay, I think the translation might still be slightly confusing, so apologies if I'm not fully answering the question. I know that Natalie had to hop off, so it's just me now, but I really would just build on what we shared in terms of INEE. I think the way that we are starting to try and address this is, of course, through our network spaces and by convening members at this national or regional level around key questions of evidence production, dissemination, identification of evidence gaps. So ensuring that research agendas are not driven by Northern or Western institutions, and that practitioners commissioners, policymakers, academics at a national need to engage, I guess, with the West as well. Is an interesting one and is quite
Sonia,
Sonia, on a des soucis techniques.
I think you have problems of connection now. I think it's happening today. There are some problems of connection. Yes, we lost Sonia. So I think Maciel, maybe we could just close this panel and continue. Really interesting conversation. Really interesting conversation. Just to highlight one point regarding the work we do. Trying to connect those local, national priorities efforts with what could happen at the regional level, but also informed by the global evidence, what's happening in other regions, in different kind of contexts. Our main challenge and effort is regarding to contextualization of what we do within the region, when we work with the Eastern Caribbean, when we work with the Central America or South America. That's the main challenge, but we completely share the idea that this is driven by high quality standards, and that's something that we would like to reinforce. That we really push for that high quality standards, and we need to discuss about methodologies, about robust data, and so on and so forth. So Sonja, we missed you, but maybe you would like to wrap up, and because we would like to close for the next.
I think we can move on, and just apologies for the connectivity issues. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Maciel, please.
Merci beaucoup. Et maintenant, on va faire une petite pause nécessaire de 5 minutes. Et je voudrais vous remercier à tous les chercheurs et chercheuses qui ont présenté aujourd'hui. C'était vraiment passionnant, la conversation. Ça donne pour continuer à parler de colonisation, surtout des regards territoriaux. Donc, je vous remercie à vous tous. Et maintenant, on fait une petite pause de 5 minutes et on continue avec le deuxième panel qui c'est également passionnant. Merci, à tout de suite.
Okay, colleagues. Can you hear me? Marcel, can you hear me? Yeah, excellent. So we will continue with the second panel. It's called Territorial Experiences of Educational Research in Emergency and Crisis Situations. This panel will be facilitated by Judy-Ann Allison. Thank you, Judy-Ann. Judy-Ann Allison Odd is the principal of a special education institution on her island in Grenada. She began her teaching career at the age of 16 years old. 5 years later, she graduated with a certificate in primary education from the University of West Indies and was also awarded a certificate for outstanding performance in teacher education. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Educational Leadership and Management with honors from the same university, her Master's in Inclusive Special Education from the University of Roehampton, London, and she's currently she's pursuing a doctoral degree in education with concentration in special and inclusive education. Judy-Ann, please welcome. The floor is yours, and have a great panel as well.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Raul, and good morning to everybody. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Today's discussion proposes to reflect on the emergencies and crises of various kinds that have occurred and/or are occurring in the region and how they affect our country's education. Considering that the territories of Central America and the Caribbean have been affected by natural disasters and many crises, particularly the health crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have invited our presenters today to discuss how education and the teaching methods have had to evolve, mutate, and adapt due to this phenomenon. To this end, 3 thematic lines were proposed: professional development of teachers, COVID-19 and educational challenges, and strengthening public education. Our panelists for the second panel discussion will present on the broader theme, territorial experiences of educational research in emergency and crisis situations. Our esteemed panelists today are Dr. Verna Knight, Dr. Shemaine Bissessa, Dr. Adelia Ferdinand, and Dr. LeFrance Joseph. Each panelist will present for 15 minutes, and at the end of the presentations, we will have a time for discussion and questions. I'm kindly requesting that we try to respect the time allotted for each presentation. I will post a raise hand emoji to indicate when it's time for the presenters to wrap up the session. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Dr. Verna Knight. Dr. Knight has been an educator for over 20 years and holds a doctoral degree in education, policy, and planning with special emphasis on the Eastern Caribbean area. She is a full-time lecturer with the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, with responsibility for the delivery and assessment of educational programs in social studies and social contexts and education policy at the bachelor's and postgraduate levels. She is also the coordinator for the Bachelor of Education program, the subject coordinator for social studies, geography, and history with the Eastern Caribbean Joint Board of Teacher Education, and the assistant coordinator for the Caribbean Education Research Center. At the regional level, she is part of the operational team at the Caribbean Center for Education Planning and has been providing support to the OECS Education Development Management Unit in its management of the implementation of OECS education sector strategy in OECS member states since 2012. I now present Dr. Verna Knight. Dr. Knight.
Good morning, colleagues, and thank you so much for the invitation to share on research this morning, and it's still morning. I hope you can see my presentation clearly.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. So I want to begin by sharing somewhat a bit about the context for the research itself. My topic is In School, but Struggling for Success, Critical Barriers to Learning for All Caribbean Schools. Now, the provision of a basic education for every child has generally been accepted by most countries as a key 21st century goal. The 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights, for example, and its mandate for education for all, articulated in Article 6, represented a pivotal achievement in the age-old struggle for us in terms of achieving or establishing the right to a free education for all children. And global progress on implementing this goal, especially in developing countries across the world, has been especially significant within the last 2 decades. And this progress has been largely achieved through collaborative commitments and efforts that are evident beginning from the World Declaration on Education established in Jamsi in Thailand in 1990, followed by the Dhaka Framework in Senegal 2000, Millennium Development Goals, and even more recently, the Education 2030 Incheon Declaration. However, along with these reports of increasing access, there has been a growing concern for student learning and an increasing acknowledgement that while the two terms, that is schooling and education, may be frequently used interchangeably by us, the provision of schooling does not necessarily guarantee the receipt of a quality education. Global reports over the last decade have especially confirmed that while the provision of access to schooling facilitates the pathway to obtaining an education, schooling does not automatically translate into learning, and therefore educational access cannot be assumed to mean educational success for every child. Efforts to increase access to education in the past have often reflected a tendency to focus on schooling and enrollment numbers because these indicators are more tangible, and counting the number of children in school tends to be an easier measurement of educational progress and achievement than trying to determine how many students are actually learning. Data trends over the last decade and a half especially show us that there is a minority group of students inhibited in every school from attaining educational success because of a very number of barriers to learning. Now, the Center for Global Development in 2013 described this trend as one that is indicative of a growing or an increasing schooling learning gap. More recently, the term learning poverty is being used by the World Bank to refer to the same phenomenon. And the concept of learning poverty and the subsequent measures of this indicator generally focuses on the number of students who are unable or unable to read and understand a simple text by the age of 10. When we consider this issue a bit more broadly, the concept emphasizes the need for a dual focus on schooling and learning by focusing both on children who have achieved the minimum proficiency levels, as well as children who have not attained these minimum proficiency levels. And as such, for us to distinguish between children who are schooling deprived, that is those children who are out of school or excluded completely from education, and those children who are learning deprived, that is those children who are accessing school but achieving below minimum proficiency levels. And so undergirding my presentation this morning and this research is a conceptual notion of inclusive education. And the notion of inclusion and inclusive education is really a fairly recently accepted construct, which has added a particularly new dimension to considerations of effective schooling provisions within the last 2 decades. UNESCO in 2005 defined inclusion as being a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of the needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures and communities, and reducing exclusion within and from education. When the term inclusion or inclusive education is used, you tend to find that many people quickly infer a reference to special needs education or education for special needs or education for students with disabilities. And this is because the initial research and discussion in earlier years on inclusion in education have traditionally been presented through a disability lens. This limited conceptualization of inclusion, however, is far from being true today. Although the reality in schools may at times disprove this, the inclusion debate has since evolved from an initial focus on the provisions for special education needs to supplement, as a supplement that is to general education provisions, to advocacy for the integration of students with disabilities into mainstream education, and generally embracing school and pedagogical reform, which is positively responsive, not just to students with disabilities, but to student diversity on a whole, seeing individual differences as opportunities for enriching learning rather than as problems to fix. And so inclusion implies, therefore, that if successful participation becomes an issue for any student, be it for reasons related to gender, disability, behavior, poverty, culture, refugee status, or any other reason, that the desirable approach should be to expand mainstream thinking, mainstream structures and practices, so that all students are accommodated. In other words, inclusion refers to the removal of barriers which exclude and marginalize students. This particular research was engaged in these 7 participating Caribbean countries that you see listed on the screen, predominantly the Eastern Caribbean region. And across these countries, there is a general commitment to the right to an education for every child. And this support is articulated in most of the education documents, inclusive of the OECS Regional Education Strategic Plan, which highlights every learner succeeding as the overarching goal for education within the sub-region. And so education is therefore perceived as being critical to individual, national, and regional development, and government's typical annual budget on education can amount to some 11.6% at a regional level. Also key to note within this sub-region remains a significant gap in terms of the levels of teachers trained and certified for classroom practice. While this has been improving, the percentage of trained teachers at the primary level still remains at some 26%, while at the secondary level, some 39 to 40%. Additionally, one World Bank report in 2013, and subsequently we've had other reports do the same, noted that despite the relatively high level of investment in education across the region, the quality of education remains low and leaves significant room for improvement. In fact, when we look at the average pass rates for standardized tests in core subjects like English and mathematics that are often taken by the majority of students within a cohort, you often find that often less than 50% of the cohorts sitting these exams will pass. And so we know that there are particular challenges. When we look at, for example, the measure of CSEC, which we use to gauge success at the end of secondary level, and we look at the OECS, for example, in terms of the number of students who attain 5 CSEC subjects, inclusive of math and English, between 2011 to 2017, we saw it was way below 50%, in generally around a percentage of 42-43% of the cohort of students in any given year. And so these, of course, give us insight into cause for concern. Now, UNICEF and UIS have jointly led what we refer to as Global Out-of-School Children Initiatives since 2010. And this study and the research findings in this presentation emerged from a broader out-of-school children study within the Eastern Caribbean region completed in 2017. It was supported by UNICEF Eastern Caribbean Office, and these studies tend to examine the status of exclusion of children in developing countries and the reasons behind such exclusion within each particular context. They tend to measure both children who are physically out of school and children in school, but who may be experiencing difficulties. As I noted, and I want to highlight even more closely, the collaboration was one that existed between the School of Education, UWI, UNICEF Eastern Caribbean Office, OECS, as well as UIS and an organization out of Argentina known as Educación para Todos. Now, the findings from this report noted that while total exclusion from education is not a significant issue for the Eastern Caribbean region, potential exclusion is. And this constitutes some 17% at the primary level, represented by dimension 4, and some 33% at the secondary level, represented by dimension 5. And this represents, in essence, students who are enrolled in schooling, but who are having difficulty progressing or achieving much success despite the access granted. And so the research is undergirded by the key question of what are the most critical issues which constitute barriers for these students, that this minority, this one third, who may be experiencing difficulties. As I mentioned or I hinted at earlier, the study had 2 phases. Phase 1, it is based on an explanatory mixed method design. Phase 1 engaged a collection of administrative data from statistical offices across the 7 territories. And then in phase 2, we engaged countries in a 2-day session with educational stakeholders, interrogating the issue of why. Why are these students having particular difficulties? And this was done through questionnaires as well as focus group sessions with these persons. Now, this slide here presents a summative snapshot of the situation with potential exclusion across the Caribbean countries studied. And the visual gives you an idea as to where the trend is going. On average, potential exclusion at the kindergarten level ranged from 8% to 15%, at the grade 6 level from 8 to 32%, or at the sub-regional level, an average of 25% for the grade 6 level. At the first form level, it was somewhat an average, well, at the second form level, sorry, an average of some 38%. And so what can be noted, especially by the visual on my right, is somewhat of a cumulative increase in the number of children reported as experiencing difficulties with academic success in schools at each of those key points in education. And so the consultation was aimed at examining the why. And these are just some pictures taken of the teachers in session. I want to share via this particular slide some of what the quantitative data to begin with provided us with in terms of insights. The quantitative data helped to narrow the issues affecting student success to 4 primary, or what we refer to as critical barriers. Based on a rating scale of 1 to 5, with 5 representing very problematic and 1 representing not a problem at all, primary issues were categorized as all those issues scoring a mean of 4 to 5, with the highest possible being, of course, 5. 4 issues emerged as the most highly rated issues inhibiting student learning overall, and were categorized as primary issues within those scores of 4 to 5, means of 4 to 5. Predominantly, inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners, weak boys' participation and performance relative to girls, low parental involvement in education, and inadequate support for students with special needs. Now, when compared across school levels, the secondary school level reflected the highest number of primary issues. All 5 were reflected at the secondary level. At the primary school level, however, only 1 of the 4 issues emerged as a primary issue, that is inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners. And at the early childhood level, only 2 of the 4 issues emerged as primary. They were inadequate support for students with special needs and inadequate general learning supports for struggling learners. Now, in the short remaining time I have, I want to quickly provide you with some brief insight into these issues, the nature of these issues. Now, the main themes which emerge from the qualitative data to describe the nature of the problems regarding inadequate general learning supports was summarized under 4 broad headings: weaknesses in instructional practices, inadequate remedial support for learners, inadequate use of student assessment data to guide efforts for student improvement, and counter-supportive administrative school policies. When we talk about counter-supportive administrative processes, these include instances where class retention or repetition is practiced, but when it is done without mandatory remediation support for addressing the learning gaps for those students who would have been retained. Also, in most countries, there was a common practice of social promotion or an up and out policy, which meant that many students who were of an official grade age were being promoted to the subsequent class level despite performing below grade level standards. There was also the absence of additional teaching and learning support for schools which received the most academically weak students, and large class sizes at the secondary levels, which made it very difficult for a single teacher to provide general and specific supports to the weaker students within a limited class period or time. Then there was the whole issue of boys' participation relative to girls. And the themes which emerged from the qualitative data to describe the nature of these problems were categorized under 4 main themes. The first was, of course, consistently weaker academic performance results from boys relative to girls, earlier school leaving among boys relative to girls, gender biases in teaching, and higher reports of disciplinary and behavioral punishments relative to girls. In terms of gender biases, participants explained that the teaching force was mostly comprised of female teachers, and the data represents that. There were very few male teachers who could serve as positive male authority figures for boys. There were gender biases evident in teaching practices and teaching styles, which often didn't include those practical activities that research tell us are suited, especially preferred by boys. There were sociocultural beliefs which have traditionally allowed for a more permissive learning style for boys relative to girls. And in relation to the reports of disciplinary and behavioral punishments, there were relatively higher reports among boys of incidents of suspensions from school, in-school detentions, and missed classes, which often set them back further in terms of their academic progress. And of course, more male students were being reported as exhibiting behavioral problems and thus being punished than girls. As it relates to the whole notion of low parental engagement and involvement, the themes which emerged were categorized under 3 broad headings: poorly involved parents, which is almost self-explanatory; poor parental communication with schools, between the teachers and between the schools and the homes; and negative attitudes and perceptions by parents towards parental involvement. And what is interesting about this particular one is that this issue emerged as a primary issue only at the secondary level. At the primary level, parental involvement only emerged as a secondary issue with means of 3.5 to 3.9, while at the early childhood level, it was not an issue at all. And we found that to be very interesting. And the final one is the whole notion of inadequate special needs provisions. And the main themes which emerged from the qualitative data to describe the nature of the problems in this area were categorized under 4 broad headings: late or delayed detection and identification of special needs in children, low academic expectation of students with special needs, inadequate infrastructural school level provisions for those students, and inadequate specialist supports for students with special needs. Now, I want to conclude with just a few remarks as it relates to the implications of this research for policy and practices moving forward. First of all, we noted a cumulative trend in relation to the severity of these issues, which appear to relatively worsen at each subsequent educational level, with the greatest intensity being recorded at the secondary school level, which is the final and highest level of compulsory schooling for most countries in the region. This cumulative nature of the difficulties experienced by students is an important observation to highlight for 2 reasons. First of all, these issues can and are serving to undermine education quality for a minority group of students' success in schooling and who are being promoted through the system despite their non-achievement of the minutes. And secondly, the cumulative nature of these primary issues affecting student success indicates that relevant systematic interventions are needed, but should not be targeted at any one specific school level, such as the secondary level where the problems appear to be mostly the greatest, but rather supportive learning interventions are needed at each of the education system levels, beginning from early childhood levels where the weaknesses are first noticed. And so deliberate efforts to monitor and strengthen teaching and learning at the point of entry into schooling at the kindergarten levels and to increase accountability for learning success by all have to be emphasized as new 21st century mandate for all teachers and education leaders. Then there is a gendered issue, gendered success as an issue. The research notes that whereas at the end of the 19th century and especially in the 1960s, the educational disadvantages of women were central to debates surrounding gender and academic achievement, By the end of the 20th century, and certainly within the 21st century, the attention has now turned to boys. While large-scale studies have been reported in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, and have shown very little difference in performance between boys and girls, that is, in the OECD and Latin America, the results from the OECS, or the Eastern Caribbean region, emphasize that boys are twice as likely to perform poorly on average than girls. Thirdly, the need for strengthening schools' capacity for supporting weaker learners. The observation from the findings was that generally, with the exception of parental involvement, most of the primary issues affecting student success were located at the school level and could be addressed through a sustained emphasis on strengthening teacher and teaching quality in schools. The identified primary issues point to a need for strengthening teacher development and school leadership, given the kinds of difficulties that students are having. And finally, the results are supportive of a recharacterization somewhat of students at risk for our particular context. The findings regarding the primary issues inhibiting learning for Caribbean students, that minority, similarly to international school improvement research findings, emphasize a multiplicity in the nature of the factors that affect student achievement overall, and which explains low student performance specifically. And so the findings support that the overarching conclusion, it supports the overarching conclusion that is that poor academic student achievement isn't a result of a single risk factor, but rather a combination and accumulation of various barriers and disadvantages affecting students throughout their lives. However, while like an OECD student, most at risk might be characterized as being from a socioeconomically disadvantaged home, or being a girl living in a single parent family environment in a rural area, or being a child from an immigrant background, within the Eastern Caribbean region, a Caribbean at risk child might perhaps best be characterized by the primary issues we are seeing arising from the study. Being a student in need of remedial learning support for a variety of reasons, being a male student experiencing difficulties in academics, being a student with a special need, or being a student with weak parental involvement and support at home. The good news, when one considers the nature of these risk factors, what becomes obvious is that they are not insurmountable and they are not new, but rather they point to typical supports that we should be providing to support the success of all children in schools. And so my final statement is this. This research supports a comprehensive re-evaluation of existing educational supports for students' success in Caribbean schools, especially given the inclusive educational context to which Caribbean schools and education systems now subscribe. I thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Knight. In Dr. Knight's presentation, in her introduction, she highlighted some policies worldwide that can really, basically policies from international and world perspective that emphasizes the right to basic education for every child. But my takeaway from Dr. Knight's presentation are provision of schooling doesn't guarantee quality of education for every child, and being in school doesn't equate to learning. Thank you so much, Dr. Knight, and we'll have some time after the end of all 4 presentations for question and answers. At this time, let me present our second presenter, and she is Dr. Charmaine Bissessa. Dr. Charmaine Bissessa is currently the acting director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and she functions as the director of Educational Online Support System. She is also the senior lecturer with the University of Guyana, where she lectures in education at the master's and postgraduate levels. She's also a fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Dr. Bissessa has presented at conferences regionally and globally, and has written extensively on leadership in education, focusing on gender. Her publications add to the limited extent research on anecdotal and empirical data on the Caribbean. I present to you Dr. Bissessar. You're muted. Can you unmute, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. This afternoon, I will be presenting on the coping mechanisms of 2 Grenadian school teachers during the pandemic. And what caused me to do this study is my concern with what was happening within the region vis-a-vis teachers being able to cope with teaching during the pandemic. So I would now like to underscore the problem that resulted in the purpose of the study. So the Grenadian Ministry of Education, according to Slack in 2021, reported that 63% of students were unable to access emergency remote classes at the closure of schools due to a lack of devices and access to internet. Similarly, in 2020, the Chaise Matin explained at the seminal stages of the pandemic, OECS member states were confronted with the stark reality that not all communities have access to affordable internet and not all students have access to suitable devices. The Chaise Matin also indicated that given that an estimated 30% of children lack electronic devices and access to online learning, the program with the member states would help to procure and distribute devices to at least 12,000 vulnerable primary school students across Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. Therefore, with that in mind, the purpose of this study was to determine what has been done and is being done in the Grenadian classrooms to cope with the pandemic. Therefore, the research question was, what have Grenadian teachers done to cope with the pandemic during in the last 2 years? And this study is significant in that it would show us some of the issues and the coping mechanisms that Grenadian teachers are using and have been using to mitigate learning loss. This study is also significant in that it corroborates a previous study I conducted in Grenada, Trinidad, and Guyana on the issues and challenges facing teachers during the pandemic. So my conceptual framework, this is my conceptual framework. And as you can see, we have the coping mechanisms. Out of the coping mechanisms, we have access to resources, and we have devices plus training, and we have parental involvement, and we have lack of or too much of. And then you have students' ability to cope with online classes, teaching strategies implemented, advice to teachers, and lessons learned. In the essence of time, I will not go through everything, but as you can see here, in California, US, Grenada, Guyana, administrators or education ministries were able during the pandemic to disseminate devices to the more marginalized and vulnerable populations. So these were ways in which they attempted to mitigate learning loss. So also parental involvement was a critical point. And in some areas, parents felt overburdened with the added responsibility of having to motivate their students, having to discipline their students, and having their children, and having to ensure that the children attend classes. In other studies, it was found that parents were very much involved in their children's studies. However, in some areas, there was a lack of involvement. And I can go on to all of these, but I am thinking of time, but the important one is the teaching strategies. A lot of teachers implemented games and gamification in order to ensure that they were engaging their students, and they were also allowing for more interactions within the online synchronous and asynchronous settings. So the methodology, this is a descriptive phenomenology where the lived experience of participants were captured. I created a questionnaire with a Google link, and I placed it in the Grenadian teachers' Facebook page called Heart to Heart on the 17th of February, 2022. And by the 27th of March, 2020, only 2 persons had responded. So I know the study is limited by the number of participants. This was a purposive sampling study where only persons who were a part of that Facebook page took part in the study. Now, when I coded the data, I attempted to code the data, although there was not much data since we only had 2 participants. I found that these were some of the issues. So for example, access to resources. One participant indicated that devices were given to students and teachers so that synchronous sessions could take place online. She stated that students have been given tablets and teachers computers to assist with online learning, which takes place in the form of Zoom classes. Participant 2, however, was more concerned about training, where she talked about the fact that they were given devices, but they were also, as she said here, teaching the students how to use the gadgets for education, getting some training myself. So she also was able to attend training and get training. She said at the beginning it was difficult, but there were opportunities available for training and teaching remotely, and she was able to capitalize on those opportunities. I want to also interject here that I interviewed them at the start of the pandemic, which would have been in March 2020. And the confidence with which they responded now versus at the start of it is clearly obvious. And parental involvement. Participant 1 said she has been coping well. However, she feels despondent when parents are not assisting their children in the way they should. However, participant 2 had the opposite effect, where she said grades and assignments do not reflect students' true performance. Their parents are the ones taught because they do the work, not the students. So we have both ends of the continuum being expressed here. And students' ability to cope with the online classes. Participant 1 talked about the fact that most of them were able to cope eventually. However, that human connection, they missed the physical contact and the human connection. And she said, in my case, we are now back to face-to-face classroom and are gradually getting back into some form of normalcy. So initially they missed the face-to-face contact. Participant 2 also said at the beginning, they were shocked and overwhelmed. Now I think they can cope much better. However, they are easily distracted. So what I found in all my interviews with teachers, there was an issue with getting students to be engaged, getting them to interact, and the issue of distraction came up several times. Teaching strategies implemented. Participant would talk about the fact that she used Zoom classes, videos, playing games online, doing virtual field trip. And participant 2 talked about gamification and using a lot of visual and interactive activities. So they both attempted as much as possible to engage their students. Now, I asked them about some advice they would give to teachers now that they have transitioned from online or emergency remote teaching and learning to face-to-face. And participant 1 stated, have a positive attitude towards change, take care of yourself, enhance modern technology, and embrace all opportunities to succeed. Participant 2 said, educate yourself on using technology in teaching. carry out research because there's quite a lot of information out there. Be the change, be willing to change your approach to teaching. And what were some lessons learned during the pandemic? Participant 1 stated that the 3 lessons learned during the pandemic were: never take anything in life for granted, change can come in a split second, and learn to adapt in adverse situations. Participant 2 shared that students are in the online class, they may appear to be paying attention to you, but they are chatting with each other. Do not take things for granted. Many students do not know how to use their tablets for educational purposes. So both participants underscore the importance of not taking anything for granted. And with that, I would like to talk about the discussion and how some of this information corroborates or validates what is what is available in the literature, scholarly literature. So as you can see, students in Grenada and other OECS islands and developed countries were given devices during the pandemic. In Grenada, devices were also given to teachers, which is reflected by the participants' responses in this study. Training was also conducted by educators in Ukraine, Greece, Guyana, and Grenada. Parental involvement in this study also reflects conclusions drawn by other researchers who reported lack of parental involvement or too much parental involvement. And students reported that the use of gamification as an instructional delivery tool enhanced their motivation and decreased their feelings of isolation. So in conclusion, it remains to be seen how this 2-year shift to emergency remote education has affected teachers' instructional delivery and what tools they will add to their face-to-face pedagogical repertoire and what tools they will eliminate. The findings in this study cannot be generalized to a larger population. However, they are similar to conclusions drawn in an earlier study by me on Grenadian teachers' views on what is happening in the classroom at the start of the pandemic. With that, this is my bibliography, and I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to present my research.
Thank you, Dr. Nisesa. Thank you so much for sharing with us some of the coping strategies that Grenadian teachers used during the pandemic. And I want to highlight here that at the beginning, 63% of students in Grenada lack devices and access to the internet. However, devices were provided for both teachers and students by the government, but there was also the issue of the teachers being trained to use the device and also being able to teach their students how to use the devices. Thank you again for your presentation. Our third presenter today is Dr. Idioma Ferdinand. And Dr. Ferdinand is a senior education officer in the Ministry of Education and National Reconciliation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She has responsibility for research and school safety. She has over 20 years of experience in disaster management through her involvement as a member of the Cadet Force in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Ferdinand holds a PhD in disaster management and sustainable development at Northumbria University, United Kingdom, a master's by research in disaster management from Coventry University, United Kingdom, and a bachelor's of arts in geography at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica. She has been involved with the school safety agenda in SVG since October 2013, and has also been involved in promoting the Caribbean Safe School Initiative regionally and internationally. I now hand you over to Dr. Ferdinand.
A pleasant good morning, and thank you for having me. This presentation is a review of SVG's multi-hazard experience over the last few years, the impact on the education sector in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the opportunities that were created for building the resilience of the education sector. This is a collaboration between myself and my colleague, Kathy Badnock. Okay, so the presentation will focus on introduction, looking at our hazard proneness, the impact of hazards, focusing on the education sector, what were our responses, the lessons that we learned, and the future of education in terms of building resilience. Now, we are well aware that the Caribbean is considered one of the most hazard-prone region in the world, and we face many challenges, including hurricanes, which we experience annually, storms, floods, drought, landslides, earthquake, volcanic eruption, and we have health risk and the new and emerging ones such as COVID-19. And while these experiences, the experiences from the impact of hazards, would disrupt our learning, we are well aware that all is not lost, and we can build the resilience of the education sector if we plan and coordinate. Now here we have the 4 key incidents or experiences from hazards that affected St. Vincent and the Grenadines over the last 2 years or so. The COVID-19 impact began around 11th of March in 2020. And as a result, school was closed 1 week early. School reopened around the 25th of May for online learning, but the grade 6 and Form 5 returned to face-to-face to help them prepare for their external exams. During that time, we were hit with dengue fever, which caused deaths of students, and we had to change the school uniform so that children could be more protected. We had to do a lot more fogging and so on, and pay more attention to the school environment. During the December period, there was a spike in COVID. And so in January of 2021, school was only able to reopen online. During the Easter break of 2021, school was planning to reopen on the 12th of April. However, the volcano erupted on the 9th of April. So again, schools had to resort to online learning. However, we know that most of our schools are shelters, and so we had to look for alternative locations so that we could continue education for at least the grade 5, the grade 6, and the Form 5. So there were the creation of many learning hubs while all of the other students continue in online learning. During that period, we worked on transitioning persons from the shelters to different locations so that we could have the schools available for the students. And we had some 56 educational facilities, which include primary schools, secondary schools, technical centers, and other educational facilities that were being used as shelters. We also had many of our teachers and principals who were shelter managers or shelter volunteers. And I'll discuss that a little bit later and the implications of that. Then during 2021, so during that period where persons were being sheltered from the volcanic eruption, we were hit by Hurricane Elsa. And so we also had to provide sheltering for those persons within the schools. And therefore, we continued with online learning. And later on in October, we reopened with a blended operation in place. Now, the impacts on the education sector was very significant. So we had school closures, mainly due to the COVID-19 and the volcanic eruption. There were loss of lives. So we had students passing as a result of dengue, as a result of COVID-19. There was a loss of instructional time. There was economic setbacks. And of course, we would have heard before that additional devices had to be sourced for students and teachers. And these are things that were not initially planned for. And so that and other issues would have increased the financial burden of the state, including things like installing new facilities at schools, changing certain things that were being used in terms of sanitization and so on. So it was an additional cost to the state. And of course, they all would have presented some psychosocial issues, increased stress and trauma. We had students who, even while they were doing online learning, they were now thrown into shelters, which did not necessarily have internet and so on for them to continue their learning. Now, in relation to the impact, we had over 1,700 volunteers managing shelters, and that included many principals, teachers, and other education staff. These same persons were also involved in the continuity of education. And we had instances where teachers were managing shelters and teaching online during the same day. Many of our teachers who were involved in the shelter operation were not able to get that summer break. And so they went straight from managing shelters, maybe a break of a day or two, and back to the classroom. And that in itself was a challenge. Many complained about being tired and so on. We had school closures, which affected over 26,000 students and about 1,700 educators from pre-primary to post-primary. And of course, we had the college students and the university students who were either available in face-to-face or online programs. In addition, the teachers union would have registered 120 plus teachers who were displaced, being from the red and orange zone closest to the volcano. However, we are well aware that these were not the only teachers and educators who were displaced, but these are the ones who were registered as part of the teachers union database. The economic impact of the eruption on the education sector is estimated at 14.6 million damage, and the losses at another 0.34 million. And that does not cover the cleanup and damage to schools that were being used as shelters. There is another 15 million, again, across 177 schools, which include early childhood centers, 106, 52 primary schools, and 19 secondary schools. There was a project that would have spent $670,000 to retrofit the washrooms of 21 schools, most of which were used as shelters. So we can see that the damage on the education sector was very overwhelming. Now, in terms of other cross-cutting issues in relation to the impact on the education sector, there was the issue of technology, and we've heard it before, that there were devices that were either unsuitable or unavailable. Many of the students had devices, they were given devices, but these devices sometimes may not have been available to them, right? Maybe other family members, there were some students who had to share devices with their siblings and so on. We assumed that all of the children who had devices had access to internet and had access to electricity, but that was not the case based on our research. In relation to the impact on the human aspect, there was a lack of parental supervision, as we heard from the previous speaker. That was also a challenge here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In many instances, parents had to work and were not able to supervise their children in online classes. Teachers, many of them are parents, and so they had to function in a dual role. And so there were instances where they were unable to supervise their own children in online classes. And as I mentioned before, many of our teachers were shelter volunteers and were also engaged in the continuity of learning, which would have been a challenge for them. There was a vaccination policy, which also affected the availability of teachers. And so there was a rush to recruit teachers to replace teachers who did not wish to take the vaccine for one reason or the other. There again was the psychosocial issues, the increased stress, and at different levels. And of course, we had learning loss. Now, the education ministry, we had to respond to the crisis situation by navigating various platforms for online delivery of education. This included an orientation process or several orientation processes for teachers, for students, and even for parents, so that they could adjust to this new modality. National tests, promotion, and external exams had to be adjusted based on the situation that we were experiencing. Psychosocial support was provided by the Ministry of Education for teachers, parents, and students. There were attempts to bridge the digital device gap by providing access, connectivity, and outreach to those students who are not accessing the online sessions. In relation to the use of school as shelters, alternative learning spaces had to be provided. In some instances, a blended approach to learning was undertaken at different times based on the situation. And there had to be adjustments to the regular term date, again, based on what was happening. We were able to reopen school face-to-face in 2021 using COVID smart protocols, including providing transport for students and teachers, emphasizing the use of face masks for teachers and students where it was possible, ensuring that there was safe distances, and we provided additional hand washing station in most schools so that certain health protocol could be observed. We learned many lessons from the experiences, that vulnerabilities existed long before those emergencies. And the root causes of many of these vulnerabilities are poverty and inequality. We also realize that many of our students rely on feeding programs, and so not being in school put them at risk in terms of food security. There was poor attendance in terms of online classes, and measures had to be put in place to find out why students were not attending their online classes. There were issues of access to technology, and in some cases where Wi-Fi, for example, was present, it was not always able to manage the increase in the number of persons that now needed the Wi-Fi. We realize also that IT need to be more integrated into teaching. Some years ago, we made an attempt here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to provide devices to teachers and students. However, these devices were not well integrated into the teaching learning process, right? Had that been done, then it meant that the issues relating to online learning would not have been such a challenge, because already IT would have been integrated into the teaching learning process. In addition, we learned that multi-stakeholder engagement is critical to bridging the human and financial resource gap. And so we need to build stronger partnerships with all stakeholders. And one of our significant challenge was the need for an education management information system to better manage data in normal times, and especially in times of emergencies. Now, how do we go forward? Reimagining education to build a resilient education sector in the future. Education development strategies must be critical to building resilience in the education sector going forward, with a focus on leadership, teaching practices, and policies to guide the creation of alternative learning spaces, a hybrid and blended learning approach, alternative forms of education, and an education information management system. Also, the comprehensive school safety approach presents a systematic way of ensuring that safety considerations are integrated into the education sector. This approach, which has been signed on to by many of our education ministers in the region. In 2017, 12 ministers signed on to this approach. And in 2019, an additional 6 ministers signed on to this approach. This approach focuses on an enabling environment and 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars include ensuring that our educational facilities are designed, located, constructed, and maintained in a manner that ensure the safety of those who use these facilities. Also, the second pillar focuses on school disaster management and ensuring that there is continuity plan, there is contingency planning. And the third pillar focuses on risk, resilience, and climate change education. So ensuring that we build a culture of safety at all levels, from the youngest into adulthood, and that hazards and disaster risk is integrated into our school system. Also, as I mentioned, we need to build stronger partnerships locally, regionally, and internationally in the public and private sector. And this is vital to support the mobilization of resources for a resilient education sector. We need to strengthen child protection policies to ensure that children's rights are protected, especially in times of emergencies, and special consideration should be given to cross-border arrangement where children may be sent to other countries in times of emergencies to ensure that they are protected. In conclusion, the nature of risk has changed significantly over the years, and this has increased the challenges in the education sector. Crisis and emergencies present opportunities to build a more resilient education sector because they uncover gaps that were hidden in the system for many years, and they provide us with an opportunity to plan ahead rather than wait until something happens and then we are placed in an emergency situation trying to respond. This is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Dr. Ferdinand. And here, Dr. Ferdinand highlighted some of the hazards that St. Vincent and the Grenadines faced during the period 2020 to 2021. She listed COVID-19, dengue fever, volcanic eruption, and a hurricane. Dr. Ferdinand also explained some of the impacts and that the hazards presented, like school closure, loss of lives, loss of instructional time, additional financial costs, and psychosocial issues. Dr. Ferdinand, I agree with you that being in the Caribbean, where we are prone to disasters and hazards, we really need to build a more resilient education sector and also to integrate hazard and disaster risk in our school system. Thank you so much for your presentation once more. It is my pleasure now to give the floor to our last presenter, Dr. LeFrance Joseph. Dr. Joseph is a teacher researcher in the sociology department of the Faculty of Human Science at the University of Haiti. He is also the director of the Haitian Center for Research in Social Sciences, and his current research focuses on the functioning of Haitian education system in the face of social and political crisis. Dr. Joseph.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Can you share your screen, please?
Yes, I am. Give me 1 second. Okay, let's try again.
Okay. Thank you.
OK. Bonsoir tout le monde et merci de m'avoir invité à participer à cet événement. Ouais, je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous. Ma présentation s'appelle « Crise et transformation numérique de l'éducation en Haïti, opportunités et défis ». Mon nom est Lefranc-Joseph, je suis membre de l'Université d'Haïti et du Centre haïtien de recherche en sciences sociales. La recherche que je vais présenter, c'est une recherche en cours qui est en train d'être réalisée au Centre haïtien de recherche en sciences sociales en Haïti. En Haïti, la notion de crise est souvent évoquée pour caractériser le système éducatif haïtien. On ne peut parler de système éducatif sans se référer au terme de crise. Donc, on considère les crises comme une caractéristique structurante du système éducatif et de la société haïtienne. Et ainsi que les recherches et les rapports officiels sur le système éducatif contribuent à décrire le système comme étant obsolète. Par exemple, dans un rapport en 2006 fait par le ministère de l'Éducation nationale, pour utiliser le terme obsolète pour caractériser le système éducatif. Ou tourner vers le passé, ça c'est un chercheur, Claude Souffrant, ou en crise, c'est un terme vraiment africain et qui domine la scène intellectuelle quand on parle du système éducatif et de la société. C'est ainsi qu'on peut dire que les crises sont présentées comme un critère définitoire de la société haïtienne et du système éducatif. Et à chaque période de l'histoire, ce qu'il faut remarquer, c'est que le système éducatif doit répondre à des défis majeurs. Et ces défis se présentent sous des formes que l'on ne contrôle pas. Par exemple, dans les années 50, il y a eu en Haïti une transformation globale opérée entre le monde rural et le monde urbain. La déstructuration de l'économie rurale est causée par la déstructuration de l'agriculture, a généré des migrations vers les milieux urbains. Et cela a causé une transformation démographique énorme et qui a exercé une pression énorme sur le système éducatif. Et pour répondre à cette pression, le système éducatif est incapable d'absorber la demande en éducation. Et cela a donné naissance à ce qu'on appelle en Haïti l'école bolette. Ce sont des institutions scolaires essentiellement informelles qui, pourtant, éduquent la plupart des populations, qui accueillent la majorité de la population scolaire en Haïti. Et on en parle souvent comme un problème. Et lorsqu'on se réfère au système éducatif, on a tendance à dire que le système, il y a 70%, 78%, 80% d'écoles sont privées. Mais la plupart de ces écoles, ce sont des écoles, bolettes entre guillemets, sont des écoles mises en place par des membres de la population pour répondre à un besoin d'éducation non satisfait par l'offre éducative et qui vient du ministère de l'Éducation nationale ou des autres institutions d'élite, entre guillemets, qui desservent une partie minoritaire de la population. Donc, ces transformations ont causé la naissance de l'école bolette. Et c'est ainsi qu'on voit que le système éducatif réagit avec résilience et créativité à chaque crise. Et cela nous invite donc à faire face à la nécessité de penser, de dépasser les perspectives faussement critiques pour plutôt problématiser les crises et analyser comment le système y répond. Donc, il faut comprendre le rôle des crises contemporaines dans la transformation du système éducatif à tous les niveaux. Donc, ce qu'il faut, donc, c'est comment, ce qu'il faut voir face à la crise actuelle, c'est comment le système éducatif a pu naviguer la transformation digitale pour survivre. Par exemple, en 2019, en Haïti, on a déclaré, et sur la scène politique, l'opération Pays Bloqué, c'est Pays bloqué en français. C'était un défi énorme pour le système éducatif parce que cela signifiait que tout était bloqué dans le pays, tout était bloqué. Personne ne pouvait sortir, personne ne pouvait accéder et aller à l'école. Donc, pour répondre, c'est la constitution un défi majeur pour le système. Et pour répondre, certains acteurs ont trouvé l'opportunité, ont considéré cette occasion comme une opportunité pour introduire de nouvelles manières d'enseigner et d'apprendre à travers ce que j'appelle la pédagogie par WhatsApp. La pandémie de COVID-19 était encore un autre défi, une autre opportunité, arrivée en début de 2020, plus ou moins un an après la période de Pays Bloqué. Donc, pour les gens, c'était un nouveau Pays Bloqué et pour le ministère, c'était plutôt nouveau. Et parce que le ministère de l'Éducation nationale réagissait différemment au moment de Pays Bloqué et que face à la COVID. On verra. Donc, ce qu'il faut maintenant dans cette recherche, c'est plutôt de comprendre le rôle joué la transformation digitale dans les stratégies de réponse aux crises contemporaines et auxquelles fait face le système éducatif haïtien. Donc, pour cette recherche, nous avons utilisé une méthode de mix. La composante quantitative est composée d'un ensemble de 120 questionnaires, par questionnaire, à cause des 120 participants et de 120 écoles dans les départements de l'Ouest et de l'Artibonite, c'est le département géographique du pays. Et puis, la composante qualitative inclut la plateforme pratique, qui est une plateforme mise en place par le ministère en mars 2020 pour répondre pour offrir l'éducation en ligne, pour digitaliser l'éducation et répondre aux besoins d'éducation, pour assurer la continuité de l'éducation malgré la rupture causée par la pandémie. Il y a aussi des vidéos hébergées sur la chaîne YouTube du programme, parce que le programme n'a pas pu héberger, on n'a pas hébergé les vidéos sur son site, ils l'ont hébergé sur YouTube, en accès libre, et puis une série de 9 entretiens avec des acteurs de l'école. Et les résultats nous indiquent qu'il y a en Haïti différentes manières de répondre aux crises récentes. Par exemple, la réponse du ministère de l'Éducation nationale face à la crise liée au pays LOC, c'était plutôt de produire ce qu'ils appellent les programmes à compétences minimales. Donc, ce qu'ils ont fait, c'est qu'ils ont considéré les réalités qu'on a perdu plus de 60 jours d'école, et on a considéré qu'il fallait réduire le programme pédagogique, intervenir sur le programme pédagogique. Donc, non pas d'aborder, d'offrir d'autres solutions, mais la nécessité de réduire le programme pédagogique a été déjà abordée par les écoles elles-mêmes. Les directeurs d'école ont tendance à réduire, à écourter les programmes pour simplement faire face aux contraintes de temps. Et cela affecte inévitablement les performances, on le verra. Et cela a aussi offert aux écoles l'occasion de faire les premiers pas vers l'éducation digitale à travers l'école par WhatsApp. Donc, on voit deux stratégies différentes pour répondre à des problèmes différents. Et ça, c'est une couverture dans les programmes à compétences minimales publiés par le ministère en décembre 2019. Bon, tous les programmes ressemblent. Dans l'introduction, on insiste que c'est à cause du problème, de la crise, on est obligé de répondre de cette manière. Mais les écoles elles-mêmes y ont répondu d'une autre manière, à travers l'école par WhatsApp pour continuer. L'école, quand je dis les écoles, ce sont certaines écoles qui ont pu se le permettre. Donc, ce programme, d'après le ministère, c'était pour répondre à la nécessité de prendre en compte l'essentiel de chaque discipline. Donc, les résultats nous indiquent que la plupart des écoles sont restées fermées au moment du pays LOC. 35% des écoles, seulement 35% des écoles avaient pu fonctionner à distance. Et 65% étaient fermées. Les écoles qui avaient pu fonctionner à distance, malgré la rupture, c'était des écoles qui ont pu se permettre de fonctionner par WhatsApp. Et la plupart de ces écoles utilisent le WhatsApp, nous le verrons. En réponse à la question du fonctionnement des écoles dans la période de la crise COVID, dans la période de confinement, seulement 37 écoles. Donc, on voit que le pourcentage reste plus ou moins pareil. Et quand on compare les outils utilisés pour rester en contact, pour continuer à éduquer, à apprendre et assurer la continuité scolaire dans les écoles qui ont pu fonctionner, on voit que WhatsApp demeure l'outil le plus utilisé par les écoles. Après WhatsApp vient la plateforme de l'école et d'autres plateformes. Parfois, les gens parlent de Zoom ou d'autres plateformes pour continuer à fonctionner malgré la difficulté. Donc, la transformation digitale de l'école vient comme une réponse face aux crises. Donc, ce qu'il faut comprendre ici, c'est que WhatsApp était c'est un outil de communication populaire et disponible en Haïti. Et c'était l'outil le plus accessible pour assurer la continuité de l'éducation en période où les professeurs et les élèves ne peuvent pas se rencontrer. Mais pourtant, la pédagogie par WhatsApp offre une opportunité pour avancer vers le digital, mais ce n'est pas un outil efficace. Les acteurs le reconnaissent, un professeur un directeur d'école qui nous a déclaré que WhatsApp n'est pas efficace pour enseigner ou éduquer. Mais c'était l'outil essentiel, c'était l'outil la plus accessible qui leur a permis de continuer à enseigner, à éduquer. Un élève nous a raconté que WhatsApp n'est pas un bon outil pédagogique. De son côté, la plateforme pratique venait en mars 2020, pour répondre comme solution à la crise. C'est une plateforme hébergée sur modèle, les plateformes restaient inachevées et peu connue par la communauté. Selon notre enquête, seulement 5% des écoles déclarent en avoir entendu parler. Et cette plateforme prend appui sur YouTube pour diffuser des contenus dans le vide. Et les contenus sur YouTube en accès libre sont peu standardisés et les contenus sur YouTube sont peu consommés. La plupart des vidéos ont moins de 100 views. Et puis, la publication irrégulière, la dernière vidéo publiée il y a 1 an, c'était une vidéo de publicité qui a... C'est pas grand-chose. Donc, si vous voyez cette image, c'est une capture d'écran de la plateforme. La dernière fois que la plateforme était en ligne, c'était en mars, mais c'était resté inachevé depuis 2020 jusqu'à 2022. On peut voir jusqu'ici, on peut voir, et on a repéré cette page archivée par de Wayback Machine. Et vous voyez que jusqu'en mars 2022, la plateforme était restée inachevée. Et ces pages, il y a ce qu'il y avait. Vraiment, c'était des matériels, des programmes réduits dont j'ai parlé tout à l'heure. Et maintenant, depuis avril, la plateforme, on trouve cette page qui s'y remonte dessus. Donc, en conclusion, nous avons compris que la plateforme pratique a échoué en tant que plateforme d'éducation en ligne au service des écoles haïtiennes. Et il a cependant jeté les bases pour faire avancer la transformation numérique de l'éducation en Haïti, car il a introduit l'idée que le ministère doit et peut gérer une plateforme pédagogique au service des écoles. C'est une idée qui doit être travaillée avec les acteurs. Cette introduction est importante, même si c'est un échec. La pédagogie par WhatsApp a offert une opportunité vitale à la majorité des écoles qui ont fonctionné pendant les périodes de crise, mais cependant, les limites intrinsèques à cet outil, combinées à des barrières technologiques, parce que les gens n'avaient pas accès à Internet, limité à Internet, et puis les élèves ont des téléphones qui ne peuvent pas vraiment supporter l'échange de documents ou beaucoup de matériel, de photos d'ouvrages, de photos de pages de livres, de photos de devoirs, de photos d'examen. Donc, cela pose d'énormes problèmes. C'est un outil qui introduit l'idée que les étudiants et les élèves peuvent étudier, peuvent échanger, peuvent apprendre formellement en ligne à travers un outil pédagogique, mais l'outil WhatsApp ne permet pas de faire ce travail. Et puis, les manifestations aggravées des crises en Haïti au cours des dernières années ont poussé le système éducatif vers une transformation digitale lente et fragile. Et puis, enfin, il y a une nécessité de penser et de comprendre les expériences de l'éducation numérique en Haïti et penser avec les acteurs concernés le futur de la transformation digitale du système. Merci beaucoup.
Julian.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I wasn't so sure if you had ended your presentation. It was really a pleasure listening to your presentation today. I saw you really highlighted that the tools that were used, especially WhatsApp, was not really the best for disseminating information to students during the crisis, during the lockdown period. You explained that some of the principals and teachers believed that it was inefficient in teaching and learning. Sorry. And also, you saw that COVID provided the opportunity for digital education and laid the groundwork for advancing digital transformation for education in Haiti. And I do agree with you. Thank you so much for your presentation this morning. At this time, now we're going to open up to the audience for questions. Sorry. If you have any questions, you can use the question and answer function available on Zoom. This event is also being streamed through our social media platforms and network. So we will be monitoring our social media network. So please participate and ask questions throughout. I'm going to ask Raul to help me to monitor the chats so that we can see when questions are posted for our panelists. So if you have any questions for Dr. Knight, Dr. Bisessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph, you can go right ahead. Any questions already? There's a question for Dr. Ferdinand in the chat. And someone is asking, could you tell me more about the methodology used to introduce the online teaching and learning devices in Haiti?
I couldn't understand the question. Maybe not Haiti.
So it's supposed to be, it's addressed to Dr. Ferdinand, but and that's from, yes, Dr. Joseph. So I think it is St. Vincent he's referring to.
So what we had to do, we had to find a platform that could be used by all of our schools and where the ministry could actually manage. And even while there were schools that were already using different platforms like Moodle, the ministry worked along with other local stakeholders to find a platform, and the Microsoft Teams was the platform that was finally settled on based on the discussion with the various stakeholders. And once the platform was decided on, then the ministry worked on training for the teachers, setting up a help desk, training for students to help them to navigate the platform. And then the platform was rolled out. In the meantime, while that was being done, there were classes that were done via television and different medium, so that there would not be too much of a loss while the platform was being developed for the students. In addition to that, devices were also distributed to support the students. And like I said, there were issues in terms of electricity and so on, and those were addressed. And where there were still gaps where students were not able to access online education, there was what we call school in a bag, where materials were printed and distributed to students who did not have access to devices or other issues. So it was a process that we went through.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ferdinand. Any other questions for any other four presenters? I would like to pose a question at this time to Dr. Bisessa. Dr. Bisessa, you spoke about teaching and learning gains during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the gains for teachers was the skills in teaching in a blended setting, as well as learning new technological skills. Do you have any intentions in doing a further study to see how the new learning gains were integrated into teaching and how it has affected or is affecting the way the teachers teach and the students learn in the Grenadian context?
Thank you for that question. At the moment, no, I didn't intend to do any further study in it, but you, of course, you have whet my appetite. So I will take it under consideration. However, I do have a student in Guyana. She's doing her master's and I'm supervising her thesis. And she is doing something with the follow-up as to what the teachers are doing now with the increase in professional gains, with increase in digital literacy, and how they are implementing it in the classroom. So thank you for that question.
You're most welcome, and thank you. I look forward to that study, that research. Raul, is there anything on your side?
There is, Julian, a comment from Monsieur Bayard from Haiti. He's representative from Haiti, from the Ministry of Education. And he's highlighting a program that the country is running on the use of radio and television. So what we call as we know as low technologies. So maybe I would like to know the perspective of the researchers on how to address how the communities, countries are addressing this digital gap, basically, and what opportunities do you see with other kind of material, as printed material or low technologies, as Monsieur Bayard is commenting?
Thank you so much for that. That was from Bayard. Thanks, Raul, for assisting me there. Question for Dr. Knight. You mentioned 4 risk factors for students experiencing potential exclusion. I just want to ask, how were the countries addressing those barriers, and were they more prevalent in some countries than the other? Like with the 4 barriers, say lack of parental support or proper support for special education needs, were they more prevalent in one country than the other?
Yes, thank you so much, Julianne, for that question. I did not try to separate that part of the data by country, because we wanted to have an idea of what the regional profile looked like. When we collected the administrative data in phase 1 that looked at the extent to which students were out of school, we would have drilled it down by country level. And there's a previous publication, and the Eastern Caribbean Study Report actually provides insight into this by country as well. But we didn't drill the second phase of the data. I didn't separate it by country at all. So I can't tell you right now whether Grenada had parental involvement, etc., as a greater factor. The data is there though. So if a country, for example, wants to drill down into what it looked like for their particular country, we can easily refer back to the data to get that done. But I don't have that at hand immediately. But what we did, we were able to pull was that it was an overall look at where those primary factors were situated. And the reason why this happened was that when we completed the Eastern Caribbean study and we presented, we traveled to each of the 7 countries to present those findings to those ministries of education. What we found was that we had discussed about 12 different factors that were impacting on education. And when we presented the report to the ministers, for example, at an OECS meeting, the ministers said, well, 12 factors are just too many. We know that there are multiplicity of factors affecting students and creating difficulties, but limited resources means we can't address all 12 at once. So you have to find some way of helping us to identify which ones are the priority at a particular time, so we can identify where the resources immediately can be directed. And so the second phase of the research was really intended to provide that kind of support so that the region, as it comes together at the OECS level, for example, among ministers, they can have some kind of support in terms of prioritizing where that focus is. And the research is really showing us that systematic supports for struggling learners have to be necessary necessarily one of those areas that we put some funds and we put some action behind.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Knight, and I do agree, because we cannot allow our students to be falling behind like that. I mean, we saw 17% of our primary school students and 33% of our secondary. That is way too much. So thank you so much for that information now. If there are no, we are running out of time. So if there's nothing else, Raul, I would just like to thank all of our presenters today, Dr. Knight, Dr. Lisessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph. Thank you so much for the job that you're doing. I think our region is right off. Yes. Go ahead, Marcia, sorry.
Excuse-moi, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais faire une petite question à Monsieur Lefranc, si c'est possible, toute court. Monsieur Lefranc, bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour votre présentation. C'était vraiment tout à fait intéressant. Et en fait, j'ai une question par rapport aussi à ce que Monsieur Bayard avait écrit dans le chat. Vous parlez de cette nouvelle pédagogie numérique par rapport au WhatsApp. Et ma question, c'est comment vous voyez l'avenir par rapport à l'équilibre, je ne sais pas vraiment comment dire, entre les technologies numériques et digitales comme le WhatsApp et des autres technologies comme la radio et la télévision dans des territoires comme Haïti où la connectivité, c'est assez difficile. Comment vous voyez ça?
L'avenir est plutôt difficile à prévoir parce que cela dépend d'avancées technologiques certaines. Par exemple, en Haïti, on a un accès limité à l'électricité, un accès limité à Internet, un accès limité aussi au téléphone portable. La plupart des gens ont un téléphone portable, mais pas sophistiqué, pas capable de supporter la charge technologique nécessaire pour faire fonctionner une application pédagogique importante. Donc, c'est un défi énorme auquel doit faire face le ministère. C'est travailler avec les autres acteurs de la société, parce que le ministère fait partie du gouvernement, pour mettre à la disposition de la société les infrastructures nécessaires pour faire fonctionner l'éducation à distance. Ça, c'est le premier aspect. Mais il y a un second aspect qu'il faut considérer, c'est que la disponibilité des matériels en ligne sur YouTube, ou à la radio ou à la télévision sont consommés par la population, mais on ne sait pas comment ils sont consommés. On ne sait pas qui consomme ces contenus. Donc, ce qui m'intéresse plus, c'est le rôle du ministère dans la mise en place d'une structure contrôlée, capable de servir comme plateforme universelle pour l'enseignement à distance en Haïti en cas de crise. Et c'est un défi énorme que l'on doit penser ensemble et avec les acteurs concernés. Et actuellement, ce qu'on voit en Haïti, c'est que le ministère fait son travail, par exemple, avec la plateforme pratique, mais les écoles ont fait leur travail pour résoudre leurs propres problèmes. Donc, il faut la mise en commun, comment, par exemple, utiliser les avancées de WhatsApp. WhatsApp, c'est plutôt basique, mais c'était le seul outil ayant permis la continuité pédagogique pour la plupart des écoles qui ont fonctionné pendant la période de crise. Donc, c'est tout ce qu'il faut comprendre. Il faut comprendre le rôle joué par WhatsApp actuellement dans les écoles en Haïti et prendre cela en compte. Et le ministère a échoué avec le programme pratique. Probablement, ils vont le relancer. Je dois discuter avec eux. Je dois les contacter à ce sujet. Mais j'observe la plateforme. J'ai copié toutes les informations dessus pour comprendre comment ça fonctionne et en quoi ça peut répondre aux besoins d'éducation à distance en Haïti. Et le problème en Haïti, c'est que les crises sont tellement nombreuses, c'est que les problèmes politiques provoquent un arrêt des activités pédagogiques. Les activités pédagogiques ne peuvent pas continuer parce qu'il n'y a pas d'électricité, il n'y a pas de plateforme pédagogique. Et c'est une chaîne de crise qui continue et que le ministère doit aborder sérieusement et y répondre.
Merci.
Merci à vous.
Thank you for that, Dr. Joseph. Anything else on your end, Marcella? Raul, anything from you? Okay, well, at this time, I just want to again thank all of our presenters Dr. Knight, Dr. Bissessa, Dr. Ferdinand, and Dr. Joseph. Thanks for your willingness to participate. And as a PhD student, I can personally say that I benefited from all of your research today, and I know our audience would share my sentiments. So thanks again. I will now hand over to Marcela to continue the rest of the program. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Julian, pour cette extraordinaire facilitation. C'était vraiment intéressant aussi, ce deuxième panel, avec tous les caractéristiques particulières du territoire. C'est vraiment quelque chose qui nous intéresse énormément d'avoir ce regard, cette perspective. Bon, pour finir, je vais que remercier à tous les chercheurs et chercheuses. Et je voudrais dire que c'est important qu'on essaye de continuer cette recherche, de continuer à chercher aussi des moments de diffusion, de dissémination, de réflexion, de partage, parce que c'est vraiment comme ça qu'on essaye de faire la recherche. C'était vraiment enrichissant, cette colloque. Je vous remercie et je vous donne la parole à Raoul Chacón, directeur de Kickstacks, pour les mots finaux.
Thanks, Marcel. Thank you all for your insights. Are really interesting pieces of research presented today. Just a few words to close this. I think we all agree that we are living in crisis and emergencies. These are the times. The issue that we have been discussing is related with what the researcher from Haiti was mentioning about the crisis as a structural problem, and we see this in our region. We see situations of violence, inequalities, natural disasters that also are coming often maybe related to the climate change, of course. So issues that we need to continue discussing, and just to put a highlight in the student learning loss that is a priority for all our countries, all the region. It's a global priority as well, and for that, just to emphasize the need for stronger information systems, data assessment, learning assessment, to follow up on how to work on and develop those strategies to recover learning. That would be one of the main priorities regarding to those affected and disadvantaged populations mainly. So thank you very much to all, and we will continue in contact with all of you very soon. Thank you very much.